Ewald von Kleist's First Panzer Army did not begin as a static formation. It began as a tool built for rupture. In June 1941, during Operation Barbarossa, the formation that would become First Panzer Army drove east as Panzer Group 1 with roughly 800 tanks, organized across multiple panzer divisions and supported by motorized infantry and artillery. Its assignment was structural: break the Soviet southwestern front, fracture command cohesion, and drive deep enough to collapse defensive lines before they could recalibrate. On the macro scale, its advance cut through Ukraine toward Kiev, then beyond the Dnieper River. The distances were not rhetorical. From the Polish frontier to Rostov-on-Don stretched over 800 miles. Each mile consumed fuel measured in thousands of liters per division per day. And rail conversion lagged. Soviet resistance stiffened around key river crossings. Yet, in the opening months, encirclements near Uman and Kiev sealed hundreds of thousands of Soviet troops inside shrinking pockets. The arithmetic appeared decisive. Inside a Panzer III, the vibration of the transmission carried through the hull at high revolutions. Crews calculated range against fuel consumption in kilometers per liter, knowing that a stalled column invited counterattack. Dust choked radiators in summer, mud seized tracks in autumn. A tank weighed roughly 20 tons. A heavy artillery shell weighed around 100 pounds. A supply convoy required dozens of trucks to deliver 400 tons of ammunition for sustained operations. Speed demanded continuous feeding. As the campaign extended into 1942, and the formation was redesignated First Panzer Army, it drove south toward the Caucasus oil fields under Army Group A. The objective hardened into resource acquisition: seize the oil at Maikop and Grozny, secure output measured in millions of barrels annually. German planners calculated that Soviet oil production in the Caucasus accounted for the majority of the Red Army's fuel supply. If severed, Soviet operations would stall. But distance collided with capacity. From Rostov to the foothills of the Caucasus lay hundreds of miles of steppe and mountain roads. Supply lines thinned, bridges fractured under retreating Soviet demolition charges. First Panzer Army extended forward while neighboring formations lagged. Soviet counterthrusts began to bleed flanks. When I was studying archived railway throughput tables alongside operational diaries from late 1942, I noticed a pattern that rarely appears in sweeping campaign summaries. Rail deliveries to forward depots often fell short of projected tonnage by 30 to 40% during peak advance phases. It was not dramatic, it was cumulative. Shortfalls in fuel today reduced mobility tomorrow. Reduced mobility eroded operational tempo the next week. At Stalingrad, farther north, the Sixth Army became encircled. That event forced recalibration across the southern front. First Panzer Army, deep in the Caucasus, faced the prospect of isolation. Withdrawal required discipline under pressure. Soviet forces pressed from multiple directions, seeking to fracture escape routes. German columns pulled back across frozen terrain, or engines running in sub-zero temperatures to prevent oil from thickening beyond usability. The macro situation hardened further in 1943 and 1944. Soviet production outpaced German output in tanks and artillery. The Red Army fielded tens of thousands of armored vehicles across fronts. First Panzer Army fought defensive battles in Ukraine, attempting to hold river lines and urban centers, while Soviet offensives collided repeatedly against shrinking defensive belts. At the micro level, artillery batteries counted remaining shells by the crate. Infantry divisions that once fielded over 15,000 men often reported effective strengths below 10,000 after months of attrition. Casualty rates in certain engagements climbed above 20%. Fuel allocations dwindled. Horse-drawn transport reappeared in formations once defined by mechanization. During the encirclement battles in western Ukraine in early 1944, First Panzer Army itself risked being cut off. Soviet forces attempted to seal corridors behind it. German staff officers recalculated withdrawal routes under pressure. Breakout operations required concentrated armor, coordinated artillery, and precise timing. Snow churned under tracks. Bridges became lifelines measured in meters of intact structure. Despite tactical skill, the broader industrial arithmetic had shifted. Allied bombing eroded fuel production within Germany. Synthetic fuel plants operated intermittently. Replacement tanks arrived in smaller numbers. Crews trained for weeks rather than months. Soviet factories east of the Urals produced thousands of T-34 tanks annually, each weighing roughly 30 tons, each mounting 76mm guns capable of penetrating German armor at combat ranges. First, Panzer Army continued to fight across Poland and into Czechoslovakia as the war contracted around Germany. Defensive lines shortened geographically but tightened under pressure. By early 1945, the Eastern Front bore little resemblance to the sweeping advances of 1941. It had hardened into a continuous collision of artillery, armor, and infantry measured in millions of men. Kleist himself was eventually relieved of command amid strategic disagreements and mounting setbacks. Command passed to others as the army retreated toward the Reich's final defensive zones. When engines that once drove eastward now carried formations westward in successive withdrawals. If you are listening to this as night deepens, imagine the sound of those engines fading from acceleration to retreat. Not sudden silence, but gradual reduction. Columns that once stretched forward across open steppe now moving back through narrower roads, fuel gauges hovering near empty, orders shorter, maps smaller. Let that steady mechanical hum slow in your mind. In the chapters ahead, we will move step by step through those campaigns. Ukraine, the Caucasus, the encirclements, the withdrawals, examining where First Panzer Army outpaced opposition and where it stalled under strain. This is the entire history of Kleist's First Panzer Army. Chapter 1. The Ledger Before the Lightning, the 14th of February, 1940. You're not a battlefield, not a burning city. A desk in Freiburg, and a carbon copy so faint that the man reading it has to tilt it toward the light to make out the numbers in column 7. The form is a routine Waffenamt equipment inspection report, the kind of administrative paperwork that military historians usually skip straight past, on their way to the dramatic stuff. But this one has a torn corner where someone pressed a pen so hard through a correction that the paper itself gave way. The original figure in the operational ready column for Panzer III units was 91. The corrected figure, written above it in a slightly different ink, is 63. 28 tanks. 28 machines that existed on the authorized strength list and did not, in fact, exist on any road that morning. And that tear in the paper is where this story begins. It's worth pausing to understand what the Panzer III actually was in the winter of 1939 into 40. It was the intended backbone of Germany's armored force, a medium tank designed around the 37mm KWK gun, powered by the Maibach HL 120 TRM engine producing 300 horsepower, and intended to fight other tanks while the Panzer IV handled infantry support. The problem, already visible in the inspection reports from the Polish campaign of September 1939, was that the 37mm gun was already being called Die Heeres Anklopfbüchse, the Army's door knocker, by the men who had to use it. It knocked politely on armor it was supposed to punch through. And the Panzer IV, the version with the short 75mm gun, was in similarly short supply. The production lines at Krupp and Mahon were running behind schedule in ways that the official authorized strength tables simply didn't reflect. The Wehrmacht went into France with an army that looked better on paper than it was in a workshop. When Ewald von Kleist received command of Panzer Group Kleist in March of 1940, the massed armored force assembled for the Sichelschnitt cut through the Ardennes. His first recorded act, preserved in the headquarters war diary, was to request a fuel supply estimate. The response took 11 days. 11 days to tell a Panzer Group commander how much fuel he could expect for the most audacious armored operation in military history. I find this detail almost impossible to set aside when reading the triumphalist accounts that followed. The formation was being assembled at speed, under political pressure, and its own logistics apparatus was already lagging behind its operational ambitions by nearly 2 weeks before the campaign started. That isn't a small administrative hiccup. That's the shape of every problem that will follow, miniaturized. What made Panzer Group Kleist structurally possible was also what made it structurally fragile. The grouping assembled approximately 41,140 vehicles onto roads that had been engineered for agricultural carts and the occasional touring automobile. The Ardennes route, the supposedly impassable route that was the genius of Erich von Manstein's planning, was impassable precisely because it was too narrow and too steep for modern mechanized forces. One broken-down supply truck in the wrong place could back up armor for 6 hours. This wasn't speculation. It had happened in exercises. The engineers knew it. The traffic management problem was documented in the 14th Panzer Corps bridging annex before the first tank moved. The solution was improvisation as doctrine. Keep moving, maintain momentum, don't stop. The problem with improvisation as doctrine is that it rewards the times it works and produces catastrophe the times it doesn't. There's another technical problem buried in those pre-war inspection files that I keep returning to: the Maikop engine's cooling system. 300 horsepower in a 19.8-ton vehicle sounds adequate, and in Central European summer conditions on paved roads it was. The engine's weakness wasn't power, it was its air intake design. The cooling fan drew from within the engine compartment, rather than ducting fresh air from outside, which meant that in dusty conditions, the Mall dry paper air filter, rated for 500 kilometers between replacements, could clog within 150 to 200 kilometers. The Kraftfahrvorschrift, the driver's technical manual, specified the 500-kilometer interval. Nobody in the planning process for the Ardennes crossed that specification against the chalk dust roads of northern France in summer. The engine was, quietly, wrong for the conditions it was about to face. It would remain wrong for Russia. It would be nearly catastrophically wrong for the Caucasus. When I was cross-referencing the pre-campaign maintenance records with the Waffenamt quarterly reports for the fourth quarter of 1939, I found something that stopped me cold. Guderian's memoir, Panzer Leader, published in 1952, describes the armored force entering 1940 in a state of high operational readiness and high morale. The Waffenamt report for the same period, shelf reference B-A-MARH8, volume 1020, records that 30% of all Panzer IIs assigned to the Armored Corps were non-operational due to transmission and drive sprocket failures carried over from Poland. 30%. That's not a rounding error. One source is the testimony of a man who needed to believe in his own creation, and the other was written by engineers who had to lie under vehicles in January and fix what the campaign had broken. Both documents exist. Only one of them gets quoted in the popular histories. The 6-week spare parts supply depth isn't an oversight that historians invented with hindsight. It was a deliberate Waffenamt planning decision, specifically calibrated to the assumption that decisive campaigns lasted 6 weeks, derived from the experience of August to September 1914. The logic was clean and entirely reasonable given what the German military knew. France in 1914 had been decided, or nearly decided, in roughly 6 weeks. Therefore, 6 weeks was the relevant planning horizon for intensive mechanized operations. Every engine spare, every transmission seal, and every track link in the supply depots was stocked to sustain the force for 6 weeks. Not 7, not 10, 6 weeks. This calculation would survive unrevised into the planning for Operation Barbarossa, a campaign against a country roughly 40 times the size of Belgium. The Meuse bridges present one more quiet technical problem worth noting here, because it connects everything. When the bridging engineers assessed the Meuse crossing points at Sedan and the surrounding area, they found that the certified load ratings on the existing bridges averaged 16 tons. The Panzer III weighed 19.8 tons. The Panzer IV, in its Ausführung C version, weighed 23 tons. Crossing those bridges meant crossing beyond their rated capacity every single time, with every single vehicle. The engineer's solution: spread the crossing window, minimize dwell time on the structure, keep the column moving, is documented in the bridging annex and became a standard of improvised German military engineering that would be repeated all the way to the Caucasus. Whether the bridge held was partly skill and mostly luck. The engineers did not tell the tank commanders the load rating numbers. This too is in the records. The formation that would become the First Panzer Army was built then, on a foundation of optimistic accounting that had been quietly documented by the very engineers and inspectors who were supposed to maintain it. The gap between the authorized number 91 and the corrected number 63 in that February 1940 inspection report wasn't unusual, and it wasn't even particularly large by the standards of the time. What makes it significant is that it was noted, corrected, and then filed, and nobody upstream in the command chain ever formally asked why the gap existed, what it meant, or whether it would get worse. The question wasn't suppressed. It simply wasn't asked. That's a different problem entirely and a harder one to fix. What lingers sitting with these documents is a specific kind of institutional psychology. The German army in early 1940 was an organization that had just won a short war in Poland faster than almost anyone predicted, was planning an attack that military orthodoxy said was impossible, and was staffed at its senior levels by men whose professional identities were bound up in the validity of their own operational theories. Cross-referencing maintenance logs wasn't the kind of work that made careers. The inspection report with the torn page was the third carbon copy, the copy that went to the filing system, not the copy that went to the general. And the question this series keeps asking, starting here, is what happens to an army when the gap between the filing system and the general's desk grows wide enough to swallow a campaign? Chapter 2, The Sichel-Schnitt Knife, Sedan, May 1940. There is a margin note in Guderian's headquarters war diary for the 15th of May, 1940, timed at 0740 hours. The entry itself is unremarkable, a standard unit position report, the kind filed every few hours in a moving headquarters. But written beside it, in a different hand with a blunter nib, are two words: halt, warum, stop. Why? The identity of the annotator is unknown. The handwriting doesn't match any of the identified staff officers. But the question it asks, why are we stopping, is exactly the question Guderian was simultaneously screaming at Kleist's liaison officer down the telephone. And the answer to it tells us more about the Sedan breakthrough than any account of the Stukas or the infantry assault. The operational plan for Panzer Group Kleist, crossing the Meuse at Sedan on the 13th of May, 1940 was genuinely audacious, but its audacity has obscured what it actually required. The crossing demanded that German infantry, supported by dive bombers, cross a major river obstacle, establish bridgeheads, and when hold them long enough for engineers to construct pontoon bridges capable of carrying armor, all before the French could bring their mobile reserves to bear. The engineers who built those bridges worked through the night of the 13th into the 14th, with the knowledge that the pontoon structures they were building had a load capacity of 24 tons. The Panzer IV in its Ausführung C weighed 23 tons. There was exactly 1 ton of margin between the tank and the bridge's structural limit. The engineers knew this. The tank commanders did not. It is in the bridging unit's after-action report, and nowhere in the armored unit histories. The Junkers Ju 87 Stuka's role at Sedan is usually told as a story of psychological terror, the screaming siren, the near-vertical dive. All the French soldiers fleeing their bunkers in a kind of mass panic that no military training had prepared them for. That's true as far as it goes, but the technical reality is more specific and more interesting. The Stuka carried a 500-kilogram bomb that created a crater approximately 5 meters wide and 3 meters deep in standard soil. Penetrating the concrete walls of Maginot extension bunkers required a direct hit from the 1,000-kilogram variant. Almost none of the sorties on the 13th of May used the heavier bomb. The forward airfields couldn't accommodate the range-to-target calculation at full bomb weight from their current positions. The bunker walls weren't being penetrated. The mechanism of French abandonment was overpressure from near misses, concussive blasts that left men physically uninjured and psychologically unable to function. The French soldiers in those bunkers weren't cowards. They were experiencing something their bodies weren't built to withstand. Kleist's halt order, the single most controversial command decision of the entire France campaign, has been debated in military history literature for more than 80 years, and the debate still turns on which set of sources you believe. Guderian's account in Panzer Leader frames the order as timidity from above, overcome by his own threat to resign and his aggressive renegotiation of the halt into a reconnaissance in force. He wins the argument and the advance continues. The narrative is clean and flattering. The Panzer Group Kleist War Diary, a catalog reference BA-MARH211, tells a different story. The halt order emerged from a corps-level traffic management problem. Ammunition supply for the lead elements of the 1st Panzer Division was genuinely running short, and the supply columns were 48 hours behind the spearhead. Kleist wasn't timid. He was looking at a fuel gauge and an ammunition count that Guderian wasn't acknowledging. Both men were right about something. Neither account is complete. When I was reading through the fuel consumption logs for the 1st and 2nd Panzer Divisions during the breakout west from Sedan toward the English Channel, I found a figure that I've seen cited almost nowhere in the operational histories. Each Panzer III consumed approximately 115 liters of fuel per 100 kilometers cross-country. The distance covered in the 72-hour period following the Meuse crossing was roughly 130 kilometers. The authorized fuel load for the formation was exactly sufficient for that distance, with no margin at all. One damaged bridge, one wrong turn on a French country road, one convoy that got lost in the dark, and the spearhead stops. The advance that became celebrated as a demonstration of German operational genius was running, literally, on the edge of empty. It fascinates me how Kleist himself vanishes from most popular accounts of the France campaign after the Meuse crossing. Guderian's personality and his subsequent memoir dominate the historiography so completely that Kleist becomes a kind of friction, the cautious superior that the bold subordinate had to overcome. But Kleist's actual concern during the halt order controversy wasn't excessive caution in the abstract. He had a map. On that map was a large question mark over the reported position of the French 4th Armored Division, commanded by a relatively obscure colonel named Charles de Gaulle. Kleist was right to have the question mark there. De Gaulle's formation did attack the exposed flank, not once, but twice on the 17th and 19th of May. Neither attack succeeded, but they weren't nothing. Kleist was overruled not by a superior argument, but by events that happened to go in Germany's favor. The moment the 2nd Panzer Division reached the English Channel at Abbeville on the 20th of May at approximately 2100 hours is one of the iconic images of the war. The Wehrmacht at the sea, France cut in two. The War Diary records a lieutenant wading into the surf. What the War Diary's logistics annex records, on the same page and in the same handwriting, is that fuel consumption since the 10th of May had exceeded projections by 23%. The formation had won one of the most decisive operational victories in military history. It had also consumed its emergency reserve and was running on what should have been next week's supply. The two facts sit side by side in the document without comment, which is perhaps the most honest way they could have been recorded. The physical cost of the France campaign to Panzer Group Kleist's vehicles was documented in the end-of-campaign equipment returns, and the numbers are more sobering than the victory narrative usually acknowledges. Track wear, transmission stress from French chalk roads, and the constant high-tempo operational pace had put most of the Panzer III and IV fleet into the maintenance queue before the armistice was signed. Workshop-level repairs, the kind that couldn't be done in the field, were logged for a significant percentage of the operational vehicles. The formations were being stood down, refitted, and rebuilt. The lesson that German armor doctrine drew from France was that momentum could override logistics, that if you move fast enough, supply constraints became someone else's problem. That lesson was wrong, but it was the lesson a string of operational successes produced, and it's very difficult to argue against success. The wrong lesson, drawn clearly and confidently by the formations that had just pulled off a miracle, traveled forward in time into every subsequent campaign. Even the 6-week supply depth that wasn't questioned before France wasn't questioned after France either, because France had lasted 6 weeks and Germany had won. The filter interval that worked on French paved roads hadn't been tested against Russian summer dust yet. The bridges that held under tanks whose weight exceeded their rated capacity didn't fail, so the calculation was never revised. The improvisation that had worked became doctrine. The luck that had held became expected. And Kleist, who had asked the questions nobody wanted to answer and been overruled by events rather than by arguments, took his formation east. And what the Sedan crossing ultimately proved, and this is the unresolved tension that travels forward through this entire series, is that a military organization can win decisively while operating on the edge of its material limits, and that winning in those conditions doesn't teach you where the actual limit is. It teaches you that the limit is further away than you thought. When you take that lesson to a country roughly 40 times the size of France, across roads that make chalk tracks look like autobahns, the question isn't whether you'll find the limit. The question is whether you'll find it before or after you're too far from home to fix it. Chapter 3. Yugoslavia, the detour that broke the schedule. Look at the 1st Panzer Division's vehicle status report for the 30th of April, 1941. It's a standard Wehrmacht form, Vordruck KSTN, filled in with the kind of mechanical tidiness that German military administration seemed to produce almost automatically. The columns are neat, the numbers are clean, but in the remarks box at the bottom, the space that most units left blank, a maintenance officer has written, Getriebesfälle, planmäßig nicht vorhersehbar, Bergstraßen, transmission failures, not foreseeable by standard calculation, mountain roads. He isn't complaining. He isn't requesting anything. He's updating the formula. He's telling whoever reads this that the formulas they've been using for transmission life cycle don't apply here, and that someone needs to know that before they plan the next campaign. Nobody revised the formula before Barbarossa. The Yugoslav campaign of April 1941 lasted 11 days. It is almost universally treated as a brief, efficient sideshow, a necessary distraction that delayed Barbarossa by a few weeks, and is otherwise operationally unremarkable. The German formations that fought it won so handily that the campaign barely registers in most accounts of the war in the East. What those accounts tend to skip over entirely is the maintenance invoice. Yugoslavia isn't a detour. It's a workshop charge that gets applied to every tank that goes to Russia. The roads in the Vardar corridor average 3.8 meters in width. A Panzer III is 2.95 meters wide. Passing a broken-down vehicle on a mountain road meant putting one track off the edge of the surface, on a 15% gradient. Loading the outside drive sprocket to approximately 140% of its rated stress tolerance. That figure is in the road survey attached to the 14th Panzer Corps Operations Annex. It is not in any memoir. The ZFSSG-77 Synchro Mesh gearbox fitted to the Panzer III was a genuine engineering achievement for its era. 6 forward speeds, synchronized shifting, designed specifically for road use. It was far more sophisticated than the gearboxes in most comparable vehicles of the period. Its weakness was structural rather than conceptual. The brass synchronizer ring for 4th and 5th gear wore down under repeated high-stress shifting cycles. On a mountain road, a driver shifts between 3rd and 4th gear constantly, climbing in 3rd, cresting and shifting up, sensing a steeper gradient and dropping back, climbing again. The ring's tolerance was calculated for road driving. In Yugoslavia, a single day of mountain operation could produce 200 or more such shift cycles. The Waffenamt failure analysis conducted after the campaign calculated that every 100 kilometers of Yugoslav mountain operation reduced the effective service life of the SSG-77 by roughly the equivalent of 300 kilometers of road use. The replacement synchronizer collar was a workshop-level repair. It was not a stocked field item. By the time the 11th Panzer Division's maintenance log records 23 Panzer IIIs requiring gearbox inspection before continuing the advance on the 10th of April at Skopje. Thus, about 15% of operational strength has been paused for between 36 and 72 hours for a problem that the pre-campaign planning hadn't modeled. Kleist raised this formally with OKH in May of 1941. His request, a 6-week maintenance pause before Barbarossa, was denied. The denial document exists in the Army Group South files. It's a single paragraph. It contains no technical counterargument, no engineer's assessment of whether the concern was valid, no alternative proposal. It simply states that the operational schedule does not permit delay. This isn't Hitler's interference. This is OKH. The men who planned Barbarossa looked at Kleist's maintenance concerns and decided the schedule mattered more than the machines. There's a historiographical debate embedded in this chapter that I find genuinely unresolved. The standard interpretation, advanced most forcefully by David Irving in his early work and broadly accepted in the English-language historiography for decades, is that the Balkan campaign delayed Barbarossa from mid-May to the 22nd of June, and that this calendar delay denied Army Group Center the weeks it needed to reach Moscow before winter. Soviet historians, particularly Anfilov, in Proval Blitzkriege in 1974, pushed back hard on this, arguing that the delay was marginal and that German armor was fully combat-ready by June. John Erickson, whose road to Stalingrad remains one of the best things ever written about the Eastern Front, tends toward the view that the spring mud season would have made an earlier start impractical regardless. What the KFZ maintenance records suggest is a different argument entirely, that the issue isn't the calendar delay, but the mechanical debt. The formations were operationally ready by German paper standards on the 22nd of June. The transmissions inside the tanks told a different story. When I was cross-referencing the rail loading reports for the move from Yugoslavia back to Romania and then to Barbarossa start positions, I found a classification I hadn't expected to see in such numbers. 7% of Panzer IIIs were listed as Dringliche Instandsetzung, urgent repair priority. These weren't tanks being transported under their own power to the front. They were cargo. They were being transported to the front as objects awaiting repair, which would need to happen before they could be used as weapons. 7% of the formation's tank strength arrived in the east on flat cars, not driving in under their own engines before the campaign began. This figure doesn't appear in any operational history I've read. It's in the rail loading tables. You have to want to find it. The physical geography of Yugoslavia imposed costs that nobody in the planning process had modeled because the planning assumption was that the campaign would be brief, the roads would be manageable, and the vehicles would be properly repaired before whatever came next. 2 of those 3 assumptions turned out to be correct. The roads were not manageable, not for vehicles designed for European roads, not at the pace and volume being demanded. Every kilometer of mountain gradient extracted a few millimeters of brass from the synchronizer rings. Every overloaded bridge crossing pushed the torsion bars in the suspension slightly closer to their failure threshold. By the time the formations reached their Barbarossa start positions, they were carrying an invisible deficit, not of men, not of equipment on the manifest, but of remaining service life in components that would be needed most in the worst conditions yet encountered. The trains that carried the armored formations east through May and early June of 1941 passed through some of the most beautiful countryside in Central Europe. Maintenance officers riding in those trains were looking at their clipboard logs. The Panzer III crews who would cross into the Soviet Union on the 22nd of June were, in many cases, riding vehicles that had already traveled farther than their gearboxes were designed to sustain. The mechanics knew it. The divisional maintenance report said so plainly. The knowledge existed exactly where knowledge that nobody acted on always exists, filed correctly, indexed properly, and completely without consequence. What the Yugoslavia episode reveals, taken seriously as a maintenance story rather than an operational footnote, is that the Wehrmacht's command system had a consistent failure mode in the upward direction. Information traveled down, orders, directives, operational plans, with efficiency and speed. Information traveled up, maintenance concerns, logistics shortfalls, technical assessments, slowly, incompletely, and with a built-in pressure to minimize bad news. Kleist raised the concern. It was denied without engagement. The pattern established here of a commanding general identifying a quantified problem and receiving a denial that contains no counter-argument will repeat itself. It will repeat itself at Rostov, It will repeat itself in the Caucasus. It will repeat itself 8 times in the winter of 1943 into 44. Yugoslavia is where the pattern becomes visible for the first time. The transmission formula the maintenance officer updated in his remarks box on the 30th of April, 1941, was never formally revised before Barbarossa. It's a small thing, a technical note on a routine form. But the Russian summer roads were dustier than anything in Yugoslavia, and they were longer. Yeah, and they were harder on everything mechanical than any road the Wehrmacht had yet encountered. The formula the maintenance officer wrote, not foreseeable by standard calculation, beside, was already insufficient for Yugoslavia. The campaigns ahead would not be more forgiving. Chapter 4. Barbarossa, the first week's diary. The diary is small. Standard Wehrmacht issue, a Soldbuch notebook repurposed for personal writing. The kind of notebook a soldier carried because it was there, not because he'd planned to be a diarist. The entry for the 22nd of June, 1941, begins not with the invasion of the Soviet Union. It begins with a complaint about the ventilation fan. 2 days of a high-pitched noise from the engine compartment, and still nobody has fixed it. He describes the sound as wie ein kranker Hund atmet, like a sick dog breathing. Then, 3 lines below that, wir fahren jetzt. Es geht los. We're moving now. It's starting. The fan noise and the start of Operation Barbarossa, separated by a line break. That's the document, that's the chapter. Unteroffizier Heinrich Bull, not the novelist, a different man with the same name, serving in the 14th Panzer Division, kept his diary through the first week of Barbarossa with the detail of a man who was still surprised to be alive. His entries have none of the ideological language that German military historians sometimes impose on Eastern Front memoirs after the fact. There's no talk of civilization versus barbarism, no Lebensraum rhetoric. There's dust, heat, a broken fan, bad food, and a nervousness about what comes next that he never quite names directly, but that sits under every sentence. The 3rd Panzer Corps' war diary records the same crossing at the same time as a smooth and powerful advance. Both documents are accurate. Neither one alone tells you what it was like. Panzer Group Kleist's axis of advance took it south of the Pripyat marshes, into Army Group South sector, an operational geography that immediately created a set of constraints that the northern and central advances didn't face to the same degree. Army Group South sector had the lowest priority for Luftwaffe ground support in Barbarossa's opening phase. This is mentioned almost nowhere in standard accounts of the campaign. It meant Kleist's armor was advancing through terrain without consistent close air support for periods of 72 hours and more during the initial breakthrough, a fact that forced him toward greater caution with his armor than Guderian or Hoth were exercising further north. The operational histories that compare Panzergruppe Kleist's advance rate unfavorably with the northern groups sometimes forget to account for this. The air cover difference was not marginal. The dust on the Russian roads was a different order of problem from anything the maintenance calculations had anticipated. The Malle dry paper air filter, rated at 500 kilometers between replacements, lasted 150 to 200 kilometers on Russian summer roads in a column of vehicles each churning up the dry topsoil, the Chernozem, the black earth, created a moving fog of fine particles that the engine intake swallowed continuously. A clogged air filter on the Maibach HL 120 TRM didn't just reduce performance. The Waffenamt failure analysis conducted after the campaign showed that sustained operation with greater than 80% filter blockage caused accelerated bore wear within 50 hours of engine runtime. Units that had been briefed on 500-kilometer filter intervals were finding them clogged at 150. The drivers who didn't know this, who hadn't been told that Russia changed the calculation, ran clogged filters and wore out engines that would have lasted through the campaign. Some did, some didn't. By the 23rd of June, Bill's diary records something burning on the left side of the road that he can't identify. Etwas brennt auf der linken Seite. Ich weiß nicht was. Something is burning on the left. I don't know what. The 3rd Panzer Corps were diary records, an armored engagement northwest of Lutsk, on the same date without further detail. What was burning was almost certainly a KV-1. a Soviet heavy tank that the German crews had been briefed about but had never actually encountered. The KV-1's armor was between 75 and 90 millimeters thick on its front and sides. The standard 50 millimeter gun on the Panzer III could penetrate that armor from the side at ranges under 500 meters, but virtually not at all from the front. The crew's training hadn't covered this specific tactical problem in adequate detail because the intelligence on Soviet tank production numbers had been insufficient. The something burning wasn't German. It was what you had to do to stop something German couldn't stop with its standard armament. When I was working through the 3rd Panzer Corps and 14th Panzer Corps supply logs for the first 7 days of Barbarossa, I found a fuel consumption figure that I've seen referenced only in specialist logistics studies and almost never in the narrative histories. In those first 7 days, Panzer Group of Kleist's formations covered approximately 450 kilometers and consumed an estimated 1,800,000 liters of fuel. The planned resupply allocation for the first 10 days of the campaign was 1,600,000 liters. By day 7, the formation was already running a 200,000-liter deficit against its planned supply. This wasn't dramatic. Thus, nobody panicked. The columns kept moving. But the baseline had been established. The formation consumed more than planned from the very first week, against a supply system that had no structural margin to absorb overages. The Soviet KV-1 and T-34 encounters in the first week produced a set of after-action reports that, when read against the Soviet records that became accessible after 1991, reveal a disagreement about scale rather than fact. German accounts acknowledge the encounters and explain them as managed through flanking fire and 88mm flak guns used in the anti-tank role. David Glantz's reconstruction in Stumbling Colossus, drawing on Soviet 8th Mechanized Corps records, it shows that KV-1 units temporarily halted multiple German armored columns for periods of 4 to 8 hours during those first days. The German accounts aren't wrong exactly. The halts were overcome, but they consistently understate the duration of the pauses and the difficulty of the engagements. 4 to 8 hours isn't a footnote in a mobile operation. It's the difference between closing a pocket and leaving a gap. Bull's diary entry for the 25th of June is 3 words: Wharton of Kraftstoff, waiting for fuel. The 3rd Panzer Corps' war diary records a scheduled maintenance halt for the same period. The fuel columns were 18 hours behind the spearhead. This gap, between the advance unit and its supply, would become the defining operational tension of the entire Eastern Front campaign. But here in the first week it seems almost routine. The advance is going well. The supply is lagging a bit. The men wait in the sun and the dust and the heat, and when the fuel arrives, they move again. And for a few days more, the deficit is manageable and the momentum holds. What strikes me most, looking at the first week of Barbarossa from the inside of Panzer Group of Kleist rather than from the operational overview level, is how quickly the small problems that had been visible in the inspection reports and the maintenance logs before the campaign began started expressing themselves as operational constraints. The filter problem shows up in the engine wear figures by week 2. The transmission wear from Yugoslavia shows up in the first workshop-level repair requests from the first fortnight. The fuel deficit against plan is visible by day 7. None of these are catastrophes yet. None of them are even close to catastrophe. But they're all there, all measurable, all running against a supply system that had been designed for a 6-week campaign without margins. The question isn't whether they'll become catastrophes. The question is how long the operational momentum will stay ahead of the accumulating deficit. Kleist's own headquarters diary for the end of the first week records the advance as exceeding expectations. The 14th Panzer Division's KFZ maintenance log for the same week records 31 vehicles requiring workshop-level repair, of which 14 are Panzer IIIs with ZFSSG-77 gearbox failures. The Yugoslav synchronizer rings are failing, and they're failing exactly where the maintenance officer's April formula said they would fail, in exactly the conditions that his Bergstrassen note had flagged, and they're failing now in Russia because nobody revised the formula between the 30th of April and the 22nd of June. The sick dog fan noise in Bull's diary was the sound of a machine being asked to do more than it had been built for. Nobody fixed it before the campaign started. By the end of the first week, other things were breaking too. Chapter 5. Uman, the Pocket and the Accounting. The Army Group South Intelligence Summary for the 10th of August, 1941, contains a prisoner count that someone has underlined twice in the relevant column, then circled. The underlining and the circling are in different inks, a darker blue for the underlining, and a blacker black for the circle, which means two separate readers at two different moments felt the same compulsion to mark the same number, 103,000. Below the number, in the cramped hand of a staff officer working quickly, 4 words: Russ, Widerstand erschöpft, Russian resistance exhausted. The question mark at the end of that sentence is doing enormous work. Within 12 weeks, that question mark would prove to be the most expensive piece of punctuation the German army ever produced. The Uman Encirclement of late July and early August 1941 was a textbook operational pincer. Panzer Group Kleist driving south and east, the 17th Army closing from the west, the pocket forming around elements of the Soviet 6th and 12th Armies in the Ukrainian steppe. The terrain was hot and dry and open, ideal tank country by the definitions that German operational planning used, though the dust problem was by this point already causing more engine failures than the maintenance units could comfortably process. The mechanics of the encirclement were sound. The distances were long. The German Army Group South War Diary records the operation with evident satisfaction. The Soviet records, reconstructed by Glantz from the Tzemo archive, reveal that the Soviet 6th Army's last operational orders, issued in the final hours before the pocket closed, show a command attempting to coordinate a breakout that German accounts don't record as having been seriously attempted. 103,000 prisoners required at the absolute minimum, nay 206,000 liters of water per day, 2 liters per person, the survival floor. The prisoner camp established at Uman had no pre-built water supply infrastructure. This isn't buried deep in obscure documentation. It's in the Army High Command 17th Logistics Annex, which records the supply-demand calculation and then offers no solution. The implied mortality in that gap, between the calculation and the absence of a solution, is in no German document from the period. It appears in Soviet post-war survivor testimony collected in the 1960s and 70s, which describes conditions at Uman that the German administrative files simply don't acknowledge. The operational success and the humanitarian catastrophe are documented in the same archive, in different folders, and with different levels of institutional care for accuracy. The captured material at Uman was impressive on paper. Roughly 317 Soviet tanks, 858 artillery pieces, and 242 aircraft reported destroyed on nearby airfields. The German logistics teams that subsequently processed the captured artillery ammunition discovered something the initial count hadn't noted. Approximately 70% of the Soviet artillery ammunition was in calibers for which the Wehrmacht had no use, specifically the 76.2 millimeter rounds for Soviet divisional guns that the Germans couldn't fire from their own weapons. The material haul was real. The usable material haul was considerably smaller. The numbers that traveled up to OKH and then to Hitler's situational briefings were the big numbers, not the smaller, more accurate ones. The T-34 and KV-1 problem had been building since the first week of Barbarossa, and by August it was producing formal technical intelligence reports that reached OKH. The standard 37mm Paik-36 anti-tank gun was completely ineffective against the T-34 at any practical combat range. The 50mm Pak-38 could penetrate the T-34's side armor at ranges under 500 meters. The only consistently reliable solution was the 88mm Flak-18 or 36 gun, a weapon requiring a crew of 10, 5 minutes minimum to emplace in a firing position, and a silhouette 2.4 meters high that made it visible at a distance that a T-34 crew would find comfortable. The German Army's primary anti-tank capability in August of 1941 was an anti-aircraft gun used as an improvisation. This was documented in the September 1941 Technical Intelligence Summary. It did not produce emergency changes to tank armament schedules. When I was working through the Army Group South intelligence files for August and September, cross-referencing the prisoner figures against the operational assessments that followed them, I kept noticing something in the language that the intelligence summaries used. After every major encirclement, Uman, then Kiev, then the smaller pockets in between, the language describing Soviet defensive capability was revised downward. Resistance was assessed as declining. Cohesion was noted as deteriorating. The cumulative prisoner figures were cited as evidence of systemic Soviet breakdown. What wasn't being modeled was regenerative capacity, the ability of the Soviet state to mobilize new formations, re-equip them at least partially, and commit them to the front faster than German operations were eliminating existing ones. The 38th Soviet Army, which Kleist's forces encountered near Kremenchug in early September, was assembled largely from units that hadn't existed 6 weeks earlier. The intelligence apparatus wasn't tracking formations that didn't yet exist. Kleist's own assessment on the 12th of August, submitted to Army Group South following Uman, concluded that Soviet forces in his sector were no longer capable of coordinated resistance. He was describing what the evidence in front of him showed. He wasn't wrong about Uman's destruction of the specific formations he'd engaged. He was wrong in a way that his intelligence apparatus had no tools to correct about what Soviet capacity looked like beyond the formations he could observe. This is the central failure mode of German strategic intelligence in 1941. Not a failure of individual analysis, but a structural inability to model what hadn't yet appeared on a map. The Dnieper crossing at Kremenchug in mid-September is documented in the 1st Panzer Division's Engineer Battalion War Diary, with a precision that makes it one of the most technically detailed accounts in the whole archive. 400 meters of river width, current at roughly 1.5 meters per second, German forces on the eastern bank drawing Soviet fire from the western side. The temporary bridge was completed in 28 hours. The bridging battalion worked in daylight under intermittent artillery fire, and at night without it. The structure, a combination of pontoon sections and improvised timber decking, supported the weight of armor crossing in carefully managed intervals. It was an engineering achievement of a high order, executed by men who were simultaneously soldiers and builders, and who had been doing this kind of work under fire for 3 months without adequate rest. Kleist was promoted to General Oberst, Colonel General, in July of 1941, and by late September, his Panzer Group was driving south toward the final closing of the Kiev pocket, the largest single encirclement operation in military history. The numbers that came out of Kiev, 665,000 prisoners by German count, were so large that they seemed to settle the question the Army Group South intelligence officer had asked at Uman. Russian resistance. Exhausted? The question mark was gone from the summaries by October. It had become a statement. This was the moment at which a military organization, comprehensively and consequentially, convinced itself of something that was not true. The Soviet Union was losing battles of an almost incomprehensible scale. It was not losing the capacity to fight. The redesignation of Panzer Group Kleist as First Panzer Army, Erste Panzer Armee, on the 6th of October, 1941, was not a promotion in the sense that the term implies. It was an administrative acknowledgement that the formation now had the structure and scale of an army without the resources of one. The new letterhead carried an implicit supply allocation that was never actually funded. The vehicle status report filed in October showed the newly designated 1st Panzer Army at 62% of its authorized operational tank strength, the worst figure since the formation's creation. The Army was renamed on the same week it was most depleted. The gap between the title and the reality was wider than it had ever been. It would not close. Chapter 6. Kiev, the largest encirclement, and what it cost. There's a fuel request in the 1st Panzer Army War Diary timed at 18:23 hours on the 14th of September, 1941. Its form, KSN 47B, a standard supply request submitted at divisional level and routed upward. routine paperwork. The originating unit is the 16th Panzer Division. The requested tonnage is ordinary enough. But in the current reserve column, the line where a unit reports its existing fuel on hand before stating what it needs, the entry reads 0.4 VB, 0.4 Verbrauchssätze. A Verbrauchssatz was the fuel load needed for approximately 100 kilometers of road movement. 0.4 VS was enough fuel to drive, roughly from one end of a small city to the other. This is the spearhead of an army group, then 80 kilometers from closing the largest encirclement in military history, running on approximately 40 kilometers of fuel. The form continues with the request in the neat, regular hand of a supply clerk who presumably understood exactly what the number in the previous column meant. The Kiev encirclement required Panzer Group Kleist, still not yet redesignated as First Panzer Army, to drive south from its position near Kremenchug, while Guderian's Panzergruppe drove south from the Army Group Center sector near Konotop. The two forces needed to meet somewhere east of Kiev to close the pocket around the Soviet southwestern front. The junction happened near Lokvitsia on approximately the 15th of September. In the exact timing and location recorded differently in the two headquarters war diaries. Kleist's records the meeting at around 1820 hours. Guderian's records it at a different map, reference roughly 20 kilometers away. The discrepancy is never formally resolved in any German document. Both commanders reported a successful junction. Whether they were at the same place at the same time remains technically an open question in the archive. The Soviet forces trapped inside the Kiev pocket, elements of the 5th, 21st, 26th, and 37th Armies, along with fragments of several others, surrendered or were destroyed over the following 10 days. The German official count was 665,212 prisoners. The Soviet figure, published by Krivosheev in Soviet Casualties and Combat Losses in 1997 and derived from post-war archival reconstruction, puts total Soviet losses in the broader Kiev defensive operation at approximately 627,800 killed, wounded, and captured combined. The German prisoner total is higher than the Soviet total loss figure. Either the German count included non-combatants and civilian workers swept up in the pocket's collapse, or the Soviet accounting methodology excluded certain categories of personnel from its casualty records, or both. The historiographical debate on this specific discrepancy has never been fully resolved, and historians on both sides have defenders. When the encirclement closed and the mopping up operations began, Kleist's formations were simultaneously the most operationally successful and most materially depleted they had been since France. The October Vehicle Status Report, filed as the formation received its new designation as First Panzer Army, showed operational tank strength at 62% of authorized. Replacements were arriving. The October delivery schedule brought 47 Panzer IIIs and 12 Panzer IVs, but losses in September alone had exceeded 120 tanks. You didn't need a Waffenamt inspector to understand that the mathematics weren't working. The army was consuming vehicles faster than it was receiving them, and the campaign was supposed to end before winter. The quartermaster's view of Kiev, and this is the perspective I find most revealing, because it's the one most systematically excluded from the victory narrative, was one of horrified arithmetic. Between the 12th of September and the 1st of October, 1941, First Panzer Army consumed approximately 14,600 metric tons of fuel. This was nearly the equivalent of a full month standard allocation, burned in 3 weeks of high-intensity operations. The formation had won one of the greatest operational victories in military history. It had also spent its reserve, its margin, and the first installment of what it would need for the next objective. The Quartiermeister, recording this in his log, wasn't writing about strategic consequences. He was counting tons. The strategic consequences were embedded in the counting. What fascinates me? Going back through the October and November planning documents for the continuation of operations toward Rostov, is the persistence of a particular kind of institutional optimism in the face of figures that should have produced institutional alarm. The vehicle status reports show 62% operational strength. The fuel consumption logs show a rate significantly above planning assumptions. The replacement delivery schedule shows incoming numbers that don't cover the outgoing losses. And the operational plans for the autumn continuation, the drive to Rostov, the attempt to reach the Caucasus foothills before winter, are drafted as if these figures are temporary conditions that momentum will resolve. The plan doesn't account for the gap. It proceeds around the gap, as if the gap isn't there. The Rostov drive that followed Kiev took First Panzer Army through the Donbass region in October and November of 1941 in worsening weather against stiffening Soviet resistance, with vehicle serviceability rates that continued to decline. The engine wear from clogged air filters, the transmission failures from the accumulated Yugoslavia and Russia mileage, and the simple mechanical attrition of continuous operations without adequate workshop time all combined to produce an operational force that was physically smaller every week than it appeared on the authorized strength tables. By early November, at First Panzer Army's effective fighting strength, the tanks that could actually move under their own power and fire their guns reliably, was somewhere between 50 and 55% of the number that appeared on the maps at OKH. The maps showed a powerful army. The roads showed something more complicated. The fall of temperature in late October and early November created a new set of technical problems that the Wehrmacht had not adequately prepared for. Standard engine oil, motor oil 20W, had a pour point of approximately minus 15 degrees Celsius, the temperature at which it stopped flowing. The forecasts for the Russian winter of 1941 suggested temperatures well below that threshold. If the technical solution, mixing the oil with kerosene or diesel fuel to lower its pour point, was known to German engineers. It required kerosene to be available and crews to be trained in the procedure. Both conditions were inconsistently met across the formation. A crew that went to sleep in temperatures above the pour point and woke at minus 18 degrees with untreated oil in their engine would find the Maybach HL 120 TRM seized beyond field repair. The first engine seizures from cold weather oil failure appear in the maintenance logs in November of 1941, weeks before the famous winter crisis at Moscow. The redesignation ceremony for First Panzer Army, whatever symbolic weight it carried, didn't change the fuel state or the transmission wear rates or the filter replacement backlog. The new headquarters letterhead was processed at OKH on the same day, in the same building by the same clerk, as the paperwork for the continuing drive toward Rostov. The formation marched toward a city it would briefly take and then be forced to abandon, carrying the accumulated mechanical deficit of Yugoslavia and Barbarossa and Kiev, running on approximately 40 kilometers of fuel at a time into the first winter of a campaign that had been planned to be over by now. Chapter 7. Rostov. The first defeat. The Soviet 37th Army's operational order for the Rostov counteroffensive, dated the 27th of November, 1941, contains an intelligence annex. In that annex, the German First Panzer Army is described with a phrase in the Combat Capability Assessment column. Boyespособность понижена, a combat capability, reduced. The Soviet intelligence rating, derived from signal intercepts and prisoner interrogations conducted over the preceding 2 weeks, assessed First Panzer Army as operating at roughly 55% of its authorized strength. They were correct within a margin of about 5 percentage points. They attacked the next morning at temperatures of minus 18 degrees Celsius against an army whose engine oil was partially congealed and whose tank crews hadn't slept adequately in 4 days. Rostov-on-Don fell to First Panzer Army on the 21st of November, 1941. It was a genuine operational achievement, the southernmost point of the German advance in the entire war. Taken in winter conditions that the German formations had not been equipped for and against resistance that had stiffened significantly since Kiev. The temperature on the day of capture was minus 12 degrees. Tank engines required 45 minutes of preheating before they would start. The standard engine oil was already approaching its pour point, and the kerosene mixing procedure was being applied inconsistently across the formation. The city was taken. the logistics to hold it against a counterattack that Soviet signal intercepts were already suggesting was coming, were marginal to non-existent. The Timoshenko-Lopatin counterattack of the 28th of November caught First Panzer Army in a position that its own signals intelligence apparatus had partially seen coming. German intercept units, the Horch Company, had been picking up Soviet movement traffic for several days. The intelligence assessment processed from these intercepts, filed in the Army Group South records, classified the risk as local counterattack capability with a probability rating of Gehring, low. It was wrong in both the scale and direction assessments. 3 Soviet rifle divisions and 1 cavalry corps, a total force significantly larger than the local counterattack the intelligence summary had anticipated, hit the German lines northwest of the city with a force that the depleted First Panzer Army couldn't absorb. The First Panzer Army War Diary entry for the 28th of November records the situation in 2 lines, a map grid reference and the note Kraftstoff Lage kritisch, fuel situation critical. There's a source conflict here that I find genuinely revealing about how the historical record of this moment was shaped. Kleist's post-war account, drawn primarily from his interviews with Basil Liddell-Hart, published in The Other Side of the Hill in 1948, states clearly that he recommended withdrawing from Rostov before the counterattack began and was overruled by Hitler and by Field Marshal von Rundstedt. This fits the broader narrative that Liddell-Hart was constructing across his interviews with German commanders, a narrative of professional soldiers hampered by political interference. The Army Group South War Diary for the 25th through 27th of November shows no formal written withdrawal recommendation from Kleist during that window. There's a significant difference between a recommendation made verbally in a phone call, not recorded, and a recommendation that wasn't made until after the counterattack began. The documented record doesn't support the memoir account, and the memoir account was written by a man who had every personal reason to have been the voice of reason. The winter lubrication failure at Rostov was the technical crisis that the engine oil warnings and the autumn maintenance reports had been building toward. Motor oil 20W stopped flowing at approximately minus 15 degrees Celsius. The temperature on the 1st of December, 1941, in the Rostov area reached minus 18 degrees. Crews who had failed to drain and refill their engine sumps with the kerosene-mixed cold weather preparation before temperatures dropped found their engines seized beyond field repair by morning. German maintenance records from the Rostov period record engine seizure, not battle damage, not mechanical failure, but cold weather oil failure, as a cause of tank loss for the first time in the formation's operational history. At minus 18 degrees, with congealed oil and an ammunition supply that had run short before the counterattack and hadn't been adequately replenished since, First Panzer Army's operational strength in the Rostov area on the 1st of December was roughly 87 tanks. The Soviet force opposing them had approximately 160 operational vehicles. When I look at the command decisions around Rostov's abandonment, what strikes me most isn't the question of who recommended withdrawal first. It's the detail of who Hitler chose to relieve afterward. On the 1st of December, Hitler dismissed Field Marshal Gerhard von Rundstedt from command of Army Group South, citing the Rostov withdrawal as evidence of excessive caution and failure of offensive spirit. On the same day, Guderian was relieved from command of Panzer Group 2 further north. Kleist was not relieved. He kept his command. He was the commander whose formation had taken Rostov, held it briefly, and then retreated in the face of Soviet counterattack. His 2 most prominent colleagues in armored command both lost their positions that week. He didn't. This asymmetry is barely discussed in any account I've read, and I think it matters enormously. Someone at OKH was keeping Kleist in reserve. Someone had already identified what the next year would require. The retreat from Rostov on the 1st and 2nd of December was conducted with more tactical competence than its circumstances deserved. The rearguard actions that covered the withdrawal, documented in the 14th Panzer Corps War Diary, kept the Soviet exploitation forces from converting a German withdrawal into a German rout. Soviet forces reached to within several kilometers of the retreating German columns multiple times, but couldn't force a decisive engagement. This wasn't primarily tactical brilliance. It was partly the same Soviet logistical problem that had afflicted German operations. The pursuing forces had also outrun their supply. The Soviet success at Rostov was real and historic, the first time German forces had abandoned a major captured city under Soviet pressure. But it wasn't an annihilation, and Kleist's formation was intact enough to be rebuilt. The lessons drawn from Rostov at German high command level were, in retrospect, almost precisely wrong. The withdrawal was attributed to Hitler's interference and Rundstedt's excessive caution, which meant that the operational lesson taken was that stronger leadership could have held the city. The actual lesson, sitting clearly in the maintenance records and the fuel logs and the temperature data, was that First Panzer Army had reached Rostov in a condition that made holding it against a prepared counterattack materially impossible. The army was at 55% strength with congealed oil and a fuel crisis. If fighting in conditions its equipment hadn't been designed for, against an adversary whose Soviet intelligence apparatus had correctly assessed its weakness. This wasn't a leadership failure, it was a physics problem. By December of 1941, the 6-week spare parts supply depth had been exceeded by roughly 18 weeks. The filter replacement backlog from Russian road dust had been accumulating since late June. The transmission wear from Yugoslav mountain roads was expressing itself in gearbox failures that the field workshops couldn't keep up with. The oil pour point problem was destroying engines that battle damage hadn't touched. Every technical deficit that had been visible in the inspection reports and maintenance logs before the campaign began had now compounded with every deficit acquired during the campaign. The army that retreated from Rostov in December of 1941 was running on the mechanical equivalent of fumes and willpower, and it was about to be asked to plan the next summer's offensive. The question mark in the Army Group South intelligence summary, Russ, Widerstand or Schöpft, had been crossed out by October, replaced with the confident assessment that Soviet resistance was broken. In December, Soviet forces were counterattacking successfully across the entire front. The question mark should never have been crossed out. It should have been made larger. Chapter 8. The Winter, Maintenance, Morale, and the Map that Changed Everything. Somewhere in the planning files for Fall Blau, Case Blue, at the Bundesarchiv in Freiburg, there is a table. It isn't dramatic. It doesn't announce itself. It's a single page of typewritten figures showing the projected versus required tank strength for First Panzer Army on the first day of the Caucasus drive. The projected strength is 601 operational tanks. The required strength, calculated by the operations staff from the terrain analysis and the operational objectives, is 780. The difference is 179 tanks. That gap isn't flagged. It isn't circled or underlined or accompanied by a note. It simply sits there, in the planning document, unaddressed, the way a crack in a wall gets painted over rather than filled. The winter of 1941 into 42 gave First Panzer Army something it hadn't had since before Barbarossa: time. Not much of it, and not comfortable time. The formation was holding defensive lines in the southern Ukraine through temperatures that continued to fall against Soviet pressure that didn't relent simply because the German offensive had stalled. But the worst of the mobile operations were over for a few months, and the maintenance battalions could actually work on the vehicles instead of chasing them. The January 1942 vehicle census showed approximately 340 operational tanks, a figure that represented the accumulated result of 6 months of high-intensity operations, the Yugoslav wear, the Barbarossa filter failures, the Kiev fuel expenditure, and the Rostov cold weather oil crisis. 340 tanks. The formation had started Barbarossa with considerably more than that, and had been resupplied and reinforced throughout, which means the throughput of machines lost to all causes since June of 1941 was genuinely staggering. The OKH re-equipment plan for the first half of 1942 was ambitious and largely mathematical. New deliveries would bring First Panzer Army from 340 operational tanks to 601 by June, the day the summer offensive was supposed to begin. This required the delivery schedule to run on time, and the replacement vehicles to arrive without the manufacturing delays and raw material shortages that had been affecting the armaments industry. The Waffenamp production records for the first half of 1942 show that actual delivery rates ran at approximately 85% of plan due to steel and aluminum shortages, or labor problems in the expanded factories, and the sheer complexity of building precision mechanical systems at industrial scale under wartime pressure. 85% of plan sounds almost acceptable. It means the formation arrived at the start date of the summer offensive with roughly 50 tanks fewer than the plan required before the first shot of the new campaign had been fired. Hitler's directive. 41, issued in April of 1942, assigned First Panzer Army a set of objectives that I still find staggering when I lay them against a physical map. Maikop, Grozny, and Baku, 3 Caucasian oil centers representing approximately 71% of total Soviet petroleum production. Maikop was roughly 1,000 kilometers from the German start line. Grozny was 1,400. Baku was approximately 1,900. The authorized daily advance rate for a mechanized force in German operational doctrine, the rate that accounted for supply, maintenance halts, and tactical friction, was 25 to 30 kilometers per day. The arithmetic of Directive 41 required either that the Soviet Union not defend its most strategically vital industrial assets, or that German logistics possessed capabilities that no existing document suggested they actually had. The Soviet May offensive at Kharkov, Timoshenko's operation, collapsed in catastrophic failure for the Red Army in late May and early June of 1942. More than 200,000 Soviet soldiers were killed or captured in the fighting around the Barbankov salient. From the perspective of OKH, looking at the situation map in the second week of June, the pattern looked familiar and reassuring. Soviet attack, German encirclement, Soviet collapse. The intelligence summary for June of 1942 used language almost identical to the August 1941 summaries after Uman. Soviet capacity was assessed as degraded. The summer offensive's timing looked favorable. The question mark from the Uman summary, Russ, wait or stand or schöpft, wasn't even being asked anymore. It had been answered, definitively and repeatedly, and the answer was yes. When I was reading through the spring 1942 planning documents for Case Blue, specifically the supply annexes that modeled the logistics of the Caucasus Drive, I found a calculation that the planners had clearly made and equally clearly decided not to emphasize in their summaries. A supply column making the run from the main railhead at Proletarskaya to forward elements near the Terek River would cover approximately 800 kilometers round trip. The trucks consumed fuel during that journey. At scale, delivering 1,000 tons of supplies to the front required the supply system to start with approximately 1,667 tons. Because roughly 40% of cargo was consumed by the supply column itself in fuel for the journey, the planners knew this. The efficiency ratio of 60% is in the calculation. What isn't in any summary I've read is a frank assessment of whether the campaign supply requirements were achievable, given this ratio applied to the projected distances. The half-track prime movers, specifically the SDK FZ7, allocated to First Panzer Army in increased numbers for the Caucasus operation, were a genuine improvement over wheeled trucks on steppe terrain. Their 8-ton payload on tracked running gear could go places that would swallow a Busing-Nag truck to its axles. But the SDK FZ7 consumed 90 liters of fuel per 100 kilometers cross-country. At scale, the supply column that existed to bring fuel to the front was itself consuming fuel at a rate that made the whole system recursive. The vehicles bringing petrol to the army needed petrol to do so, and that petrol had to be brought by other vehicles, which also needed petrol. This recursive consumption was modeled. The model's output was folded into the planning process and then set aside when the output produced numbers that the operational timeline couldn't accommodate. The assumption about Soviet oil infrastructure that was never formally challenged in any Case Blue planning document is, to me, one of the most revealing things in the entire archive. German planners assumed the Caucasus oil fields would be captured largely intact, that retreating Soviet forces wouldn't have adequate time or preparation to demolish the wells and refineries before German forces arrived. This assumption wasn't based on intelligence about Soviet demolition planning. It was based on analogy. In France, industrial infrastructure hadn't been demolished because the French government signed an armistice. And the Soviet Union had no armistice mechanism. The political and institutional conditions that had preserved French industry in 1940 didn't exist in the USSR and had never existed there. And no planning document appears to have noted this specific logical gap. The assumption was simply present, undisclosed, embedded in the target valuations. Kleist's formal request for additional time before the offensive, not the 6-week maintenance pause he'd requested before Barbarossa, but a more modest ask for additional workshop time and replacement deliveries, was processed through Army Group South in May of 1942. The response was the same paragraph structure as the denial before Barbarossa. The operational schedule does not permit delay. No technical counterargument. No alternative proposal. Yet the pattern established in the spring of 1941, Commanding General raises quantified concern, OKH declines without engagement, was running exactly as before. The difference was that this time the campaign being planned was longer, the distances were greater, and the mechanical debt being carried forward from 1941 was larger than anything from Yugoslavia. What the planning table with its 179 tank hole tells you, ultimately, is something about institutional momentum. The planning process had built toward a summer offensive. The operational timetable had been approved at the highest level. The logistical calculations had been run and their uncomfortable outputs set aside. The maintenance concerns had been raised and denied. By June of 1942, the question of whether Case Blue was achievable had effectively been replaced by the question of how to execute it. These aren't the same question. The Wehrmacht answered the second one without ever formally resolving the first, and the formation it sent into the Caucasus carried the consequences of that substitution in its fuel tanks and its gearboxes all the way to the Terek. Chapter 9. The Drive South, Velocity and Void. Luftflotte. Four's airlift log for the 14th of August, 1942, record 74, Junkers Jew, 52 transport sorties to forward airfields supporting First Panzer Army. Each Ju-52 carried a maximum useful fuel payload of approximately 1,500 liters in standard 20-liter Einheits canister jerrycans, less than 1.5 Panzer III fuel tanks worth of petrol per aircraft. 74 sorties delivered an estimated 111,000 liters to the front that day. First Panzer Army's advance elements consumed approximately 340,000 liters on that same day of operations. The airlift was covering 32.6% of daily fuel demand. The advance continued regardless. Somewhere, someone calculated that it could. I have not been able to find that calculation in any document in the archive. The opening phase of the Case Blue offensive in early July 1942 produced advance rates that exceeded even the optimistic projections. First Panzer Army crossed the Don River in the third week of July and began the drive south across the Kuban steppe in conditions that were nearly ideal for armored operations: flat terrain, firm summer ground, open sight lines, temperatures in the mid-30s. The War Diary entries from this period have an almost exuberant quality. Position reports advancing the front line by 20, 30, sometimes 40 kilometers in a single day. The logistics annex for the same period records fuel consumption running at 140% of projected rate. The steppe was beautiful and hot, and the engines were working hard, and the fuel was going faster than planned. Both things were true simultaneously, and neither canceled the other out. Maikop fell on the 9th of August, 1942. It was a significant operational achievement, the first of the 3 Caucasus oil targets taken, a city of strategic importance at the northern edge of the Caucasus Mountains. The German formations that entered it found what the NKVD engineer teams are pre-positioned 6 weeks earlier under a denial plan that German intelligence had completely failed to detect, had left for them. Demolished refineries, packed wells, stripped equipment. The Army Group A Economic Staff Report filed in late August estimated 12 to 18 months to restore production. This estimate reached the Army Group A headquarters in full. Whether it reached Hitler's situational briefing in its full form is a different question, and the answer to that question shapes everything about how the subsequent operations were authorized and continued. The Ju-52 itself deserves more attention than it usually receives in accounts of the Caucasus campaign, because the airlift it performed was the margin between an operation that continued and one that stopped entirely. That's the aircraft, the Junkers Ju-52/3M, the Tanta Ju, Iron Annie, was a 1930s design with 3 BMW-132 radial engines producing 600 horsepower each. Its cruise speed was 190 kilometers per hour. Its practical range with full payload was 800 kilometers. In the Terek and fuel lift configuration used to supply First Panzer Army's forward positions, each sortie to the forward fields near the Terek consumed approximately 350 liters of aviation fuel per hour of flight time. A 4-hour sortie, out, unload, return, burned roughly 1,400 liters of aviation fuel to deliver approximately 3,500 liters of vehicle fuel. The ratio was 2.5 liters of aviation fuel input for every liter of vehicle fuel delivered. At the operation's peak in mid-August, Luftflotte 4 was consuming aviation fuel at rates that were measurably degrading its capacity to fly combat sorties in other sectors. The airlift that was keeping First Panzer Army moving was simultaneously weakening the Luftwaffe's ability to support the operations that depended on it. By the 3rd of September, 1942, the 13th Panzer Division's forward elements were approximately 80 kilometers from Grozny. The second of the 3 Caucasus oil objectives was within operational reach. The fuel status report filed that morning recorded 0.6 Verbrauchssätze on hand, enough for roughly 60 kilometers of mountain road movement. The distance to Grozny required approximately 1.1 VS at the terrain conditions then prevailing. The gap was 50%. Just 60 kilometers of fuel existed for an 80-kilometer objective. The 13th Panzer's commanders looked at the fuel figure and the map and kept the advance moving because the supply system was supposed to be closing up behind them, because the airlift was supposed to be supplementing the ground columns, and because stopping was worse than continuing. They were right that stopping was worse. They were wrong that continuing was possible. When I was cross-referencing the Luftflotte 4 sortie logs against the 1st Panzer Army fuel status reports for August and September, the moment the airlift became decisive rather than supplementary is clearly visible in the numbers. Around the 22nd of August, the gap between daily fuel demand and ground column delivery became large enough that without the airlift, the forward elements would have been immobile within 48 to 72 hours. From that point onward, the airlift wasn't filling a gap in an otherwise adequate supply system. It was the supply system, with the ground columns as the supplementary element. An operation whose logistics had been planned around ground supply, with air resupply as emergency backup, had inverted. It was now dependent on aircraft flying at 2.5-to-1 fuel ratios to deliver the fuel that kept the tanks moving. Nobody in any document I've found described this inversion directly. The logs just show the numbers changing. The Soviet defensive strategy in the Caucasus mountain passes has been somewhat undervalued in Western accounts, which tend to attribute the German stall primarily to logistics. The passes, Klukor, Maruch, Sanchar, were defended by Soviet mountain troops who knew the terrain and had been preparing positions since July. The 49th Mountain Corps, the German formation tasked with forcing the passes, was fighting at altitudes above 2,000 meters against defenders who had weeks of preparation advantage and supply lines that ran south to Sukhumi, while the German supply lines ran 800 kilometers north to the nearest functional railhead. The Soviet defense was genuine and effective, but, and this is the tension the logistics records force me to keep, it's very difficult to separate stopped by Soviet resistance from stopped because fuel ran out at the moment Soviet resistance was encountered. Both happened. And they happened at the same time. The operational histories have to choose which one to emphasize, and the choice tends to reflect the source base being used. October of 1942. First Panzer Army's war diary entry for the 12th of October is 7 words. Angriffstätigkeit eingestellt. Kraftstofflager. Attack operations suspended. Fuel situation. Not fierce Soviet resistance. Not adverse weather. Not awaiting reinforcement. Fuel situation. The advance that had started with such velocity in July, that had reached further south than any German army in history, that had briefly seemed to make the entire Caucasus oil calculation possible. It ended in 7 words and a noun. The Terek river line became the front. The mountains were in front of it. Grozny was beyond the mountains. Baku was 300 kilometers beyond Grozny. The tanks had enough fuel to sit where they were, and not quite enough to move. The demolished Maikop oil fields deserve a final accounting here, because the original case blue calculation rested on them. In 1941, Maikop had produced approximately 3.3 million metric tons of oil, a meaningful fraction of Soviet total production, and a number that would have significantly altered Germany's fuel situation. The NKVD demolition teams that packed the wells and stripped the refinery had been pre-positioned under a denial plan prepared 6 weeks before the German arrival. The plan worked completely. German petroleum engineers with the Army Group A, economic staff estimated 12 to 18 months for restoration. Yes, the 12 to 18-month estimate assumed adequate engineering resources, undisturbed work, and supply lines sufficient for industrial reconstruction, none of which existed or were likely to exist in a combat zone with an 800-kilometer supply tail. The oil that was supposed to fuel the next phase of the war never flowed. The calculation that justified the campaign's strategic logic turned out to rest on a demolished refinery and packed wells in a city that German forces could reach but couldn't exploit. The Caucasus Drive of summer and autumn 1942 represents something specific in the history of military overreach. Not the arrogance of commanders who didn't know their limits, but the institutional momentum of a planning process that identified its limits, set the identification aside, and proceeded anyway. At the 179 tank planning gap, the 60% supply efficiency ratio, the filter replacement intervals, the demolished infrastructure assumption, each of these was known, each was in the documents. The advance stopped where the documents said it would stop, at exactly the moment the fuel ran out, 80 kilometers short of an objective that was itself 300 kilometers short of the war's strategic goal. Chapter 10. Stalingrad's Shadow. The trap closes. The Army Group. A operations log for the 20th of November, 1942, contains a hand-drawn arc in red pencil. Someone, a staff officer whose identity isn't recorded, has drawn it on the operations map, starting near Serafimovich, and curving south and east across the Don Steppe in a line that represents the projected forward edge of the Soviet penetration that had begun the previous morning. Where the arc intersects the railway line running south through Rostov toward Army Group A's positions in the Caucasus, a second person, the pencil is darker, the mark is smaller, has written a single letter, a question mark. The first officer drew the arc. The second officer looked at where it crossed the railway and asked the question that the arc implied. 2 people, 2 pencils, 1 question. If that railway gets cut, can we get the Caucasus armies out? Operation Uranus, the Soviet double envelopment of the 6th Army at Stalingrad, began on the 19th of November, 1942, and within 72 hours had produced a situation that the Army Group A operations staff were tracking with the specific anxiety of men who were watching a trap close somewhere else and calculating whether the door between them and safety was still open. The encirclement at Stalingrad was not, in immediate tactical terms, an Army Group A problem, but Army Group A, First Panzer Army, plus 17th Army, was positioned at the end of a supply and communications corridor that ran through Rostov, and Rostov sat at the northern end of the Don crossing that Soviet forces were now threatening. Distance from First Panzer Army's forward elements to Rostov, approximately 700 kilometers. Distance Uranus had penetrated toward that corridor in its first 72 hours, significant enough to put it on the staff map with a red pencil arc. The rail arithmetic when you work it through the capacity figures in the Army Group A quartermaster records, produces a number that the staff clearly calculated and never officially stated. The Rostov rail junction could handle approximately 16 to 18 trains per direction per day under the conditions then prevailing. Winter, intermittent Soviet air attack, accumulated structural wear from 2 years of wartime use. Moving First Panzer Army's full equipment load northward, the vehicles, the artillery, the supply stocks, the workshop equipment, would require approximately 120 to 130 trains. At 16 to 18 trains per day northbound, the movement required a minimum of 7 to 8 days. During those 7 to 8 days, Soviet forces pressing from the north would be continuously reducing the distance to the corridor. The margin was visible. Nobody wrote it down in those terms. The staff kept working the problem in operational language rather than the logistical arithmetic that described it most accurately. The formal requests from Army Group A for authorization to begin withdrawing First Panzer Army from its forward Caucasus positions began on approximately the 25th of November and were initially denied. The denial language is notable for what it doesn't contain. There's no counter-argument about the security of the corridor, no alternative plan for supplying the forward positions if the situation deteriorated, no timeline for reassessment. The denial simply restates the requirement to hold. When I was reading through the Army Group A war diary entries from this period, late November into December of 1942, the tone shifts in a way that's subtle but unmistakable. The entries become more careful. The phrasing of requests becomes more specifically logistical and less operationally expansive. The staff was learning to frame military necessity in supply language rather than strategic language, because supply language had a different bureaucratic trajectory through the command system. Manstein's Army Group. Dawn launched Operation Winter Storm on the 12th of December, 1942, the relief attempt for the encircled 6th Army at Stalingrad. From the Caucasus, this operation was watched with a very specific kind of attention, not primarily concern for the 6th Army, but calculation about the corridor. If Manstein succeeded in opening a relief route to Paulus, the pressure on the Rostov rail artery would decrease, and the withdrawal of Army Group A would be easier to execute on a planned timetable. If Manstein failed, the pressure would increase and the window would narrow. On the 23rd of December, Soviet Operation Little Saturn drove Manstein's relief force back from its closest approach, roughly 48 kilometers from the Stalingrad pocket perimeter. The relief attempt ended. The corridor question reasserted itself with urgency. It's what fascinates me about the Army Group, A staff's behavior in November and December of 1942, is the gap between what they clearly understood and what they were willing to write. The red pencil arc with its question mark is the most honest document in the collection, a spontaneous annotation, not a formal assessment, capturing the operational reality in a second and a question mark rather than a paragraph of careful military prose. The formal documents from the same period are exercises in institutional restraint, raising concerns in language calibrated to travel through a command system that had demonstrated, repeatedly, that it didn't respond well to direct statements of strategic failure. The staff officers who wrote these documents weren't hiding information. They were translating it into a form that the system could process without shutting down. The logistics of extracting 400,000 men from the Caucasus through a single rail and road corridor with a narrowing window wasn't a theoretical problem. It was a practical engineering exercise in moving an enormous amount of material through a bottleneck before the bottleneck closed. The road component of the withdrawal, the vehicles that couldn't move by rail and had to drive north under their own power, faced the additional constraint of the Rasputitsa, the mud season, which typically begins in late February in the Kuban-Rostov corridor. The window between December's authorization and February's mud was approximately 6 to 8 weeks. The staff had done the arithmetic. The arithmetic produced a clock. Yet nobody officially acknowledged the clock was running. The Rostov rail junction's specific vulnerability, a single bridge over the Don River through which all northbound traffic had to pass, was a fact that the engineers managing the junction knew precisely. The bridge had been damaged by Soviet air attack and ground fire multiple times since the German occupation of the city in July of 1942 and had been repaired each time, but the repairs were temporary fixes rather than structural restorations. By December of 1942, the bridge's load rating was approximately 15% below its original certified standard. German military engineers were running the artery that the whole southern theater depended on across a bridge that was, by their own measurements, structurally compromised. They kept running it because stopping wasn't an option, and because 15% below standard was better than no bridge at all. The question mark written on the Army Group A operations map on the 20th of November 1942 triggered almost incidentally a formal supply audit request to OKH that became part of the paperwork chain, authorizing preliminary logistics preparation for a potential withdrawal, 3 weeks before any formal retreat order arrived. The audit request was filed by a logistics officer doing his job. The response from OKH, buried in the logistics correspondence rather than the operational files, contained authorization language for contingency supply repositioning that was subsequently used to justify beginning the pre-withdrawal movement of supply stocks. A junior staff officer's question mark is an audit request, a response paragraph that nobody at the senior level appears to have noticed, contained implicit withdrawal authorization. These are the administrative mechanisms by which a military organization sometimes saves itself from its own command structure. The night of the 20th of November, 1942, was cold and clear over the Army Group A headquarters. The staff officers who had drawn their pencil lines on the map went back to their work. The formation in the Caucasus, the formation that had driven to the Terek, that had taken Maikop, that had come within 80 kilometers of Grozny, was still in place, still holding its positions, still filing its daily status reports. Nothing had physically changed in the Caucasus, but the map in the operations room had a red arc and a question mark on it. And the question mark asked was the most important question the formation had faced since the Meuse crossing. The answer was going to require everything the organization had left. Chapter 11. The Long Road Back. Retreat as Military Art. The 13th Panzer Division's march log for the 6th of February 1943 records a column of vehicles 67 kilometers long, moving north on the Armavir-Rostov road. The log is methodical, 23 individual vehicles tracked by their identification numbers, odometer readings recorded at the start and end of each day's movement. The last vehicle in the column, a Panzer IV, identification number noted, has a reading of 12,340 kilometers on its odometer. The maintenance manual for the Panzer IV specifies a complete engine overhaul at 8,000 kilometers. This vehicle has been running 4,340 kilometers beyond its overhaul specification, without the overhaul being performed. It isn't broken, it's moving. It makes it to Rostov. This is the machine the German army was depending on in the winter of 1942 into 43. Not ideal equipment operated according to specification, but worn machines kept running by the expertise and desperation of men who understood them. The withdrawal began in earnest on the 1st of January 1943, after authorization finally arrived in stages through December. First Panzer Army disengaged from its positions near Mozdok and turned north, and beginning the 700-kilometer journey back toward Rostov. The Soviet pursuit that followed was initially less effective than the strategic situation might have suggested. Soviet mobile formations trying to cut off the German withdrawal found themselves facing the same problem that had stopped First Panzer Army's advance 4 months earlier. Their supply lines were long, their fuel was running short, and the same steppe roads that the Germans were retreating along were consuming Soviet logistics at the same accelerating rate. The pursuit that should have been a hammer blow became, in the first weeks, an intermittent pressure that the German rearguards could manage. The Cuban bridgehead decision, Hitler's order that a significant portion of 1st Panzer Army's parent command hold a bridgehead in the Kuban Peninsula west of Rostov rather than withdrawing fully north, created a split operation that imposed two simultaneous logistics problems on a headquarters already managing one very complicated one. 17th Army, placed under Kleist's Army Group command when he was elevated in February, went west into the Taman Peninsula. First Panzer Army proper continued north. The two withdrawal axes had different timelines, different terrain, different Soviet pressure, and they competed for the same scarce engineer resources at the critical crossing points. Managing this bifurcated withdrawal was the most operationally complex thing the Army Group A headquarters had ever done. And the war diary from January through February of 1943 is the densest and most detailed in the entire archive. The bridge at Kropotkin over the Kuban River is documented in the Engineer Battalion War Diary with a specificity that I find unexpectedly moving. The structure was a pre-war Soviet river crossing, adequate for normal agricultural and commercial traffic. Under the weight of a retreating mechanized army, tanks, half-tracks, artillery pieces, supply vehicles, horse-drawn wagons with wounded, it was being used so intensively that the deck planking required replacement twice during the crossing period. The engineers replaced the boards while vehicles were still moving over adjacent sections. The bridge consumed itself in the act of carrying the army across. This is in the Engineer War Diary. It's one sentence. It tells you everything about the physical reality of the withdrawal that the operational histories can't quite convey. There's a long-running disagreement in the historiography about how to characterize the Caucasus withdrawal, whether the credit for its success belongs primarily to German tactical competence or to Soviet operational limitations. Post-war German accounts, including the extensive U.S. Army foreign military studies, interviews conducted with German officers in 1945 through 47, consistently emphasize the rearguard actions, the bridge demolitions, the fuel discipline, the careful management of the withdrawal corridors. Soviet operational records, as reconstructed by glance from the Trans-Caucasus Front archives, now show that Soviet pursuit forces repeatedly came within 10 to 15 kilometers of the German rear guard without being able to force a decisive engagement. The German accounts explain this as tactical mastery. The Soviet record suggests Soviet logistics were simply unable to sustain the pursuit at the speed required to cut off the German columns. Both explanations are correct. Neither is complete. The withdrawal succeeded because the Germans executed it well, and because the Soviet Army of early 1943 didn't yet have the operational machinery to convert tactical pursuit into strategic annihilation. That machinery was being built. It would be ready by 1943's summer. When I was working through the maintenance records for the withdrawal period, January through mid-February of 1943, I found myself repeatedly struck by the gap between the condition of the vehicles and their continued operation. The Panzer, 4 at 12,340 kilometers past its overhaul threshold, is the most extreme example in the march log, but it's representative rather than exceptional. Track life on Panzer IVs was specified at approximately 1,500 kilometers before replacement. The march logs show vehicles with significantly more accumulated mileage operating on original tracks. Engine overhaul specifications were being exceeded across the formation. The machines were being held together by field improvisation, by mechanics working in temperatures of minus 20 degrees Celsius with inadequate tools and inadequate parts, and by the simple refusal of engines that should have stopped to stop. This is a technical fact. It is also, unavoidably, a human one. The demolition of the Don bridges at Rostov in February of 1943 was documented in the 389th Engineer Battalion's War Diary, with the kind of detail that suggests a unit aware it was recording something historically significant. 3 bridge structures required demolition: a pre-war Soviet steel truss bridge of 380-meter spans, a German military pontoon bridge installed in August of 1942, and a temporary timber trestle installed in November. Each required a different approach. The steel truss came down with 240 kilograms of explosive charges placed at the bearing points. Its collapse calculated to block the river channel for approximately 48 hours. The pontoon bridge was demounted section by section and towed to the southern bank before the final crossing, then cut loose. The timber trestle was fired. The The sequence was driven by the decreasing explosion risk to the adjacent road bridge that was still in service. The last German combat elements crossed in the early morning hours of mid-February. The engineers demolished the road bridge behind them. The crossing was complete. The last unit across the Don at Rostov was a Panzer Grenadier battalion. The war diary records its crossing without emphasis or ceremony, a unit identification, a time, a note that the bridge was subsequently demolished. The battalion had begun Barbarossa with 900 men and 14 tanks. It crossed the Don in February of 1943 with 340 men and 1 operational tank. This isn't extraordinary for a formation at this stage of the war in the East. It's representative. The battalion had been replenished multiple times during the campaign. The 900 men who had crossed into the Soviet Union on the 22nd of June, 1941 were mostly not the same 900 who had subsequently been lost. New men had arrived, had fought, had been killed or wounded or taken sick, and been replaced by other new men, many of whom had also been killed or wounded. The battalion that crossed the Don in February was a different collection of human beings than the one that had crossed the Soviet border 19 months earlier. The designation was the same. The battalion was not. The Soviet forces that had been pursuing First Panzer Army in January and February of 1943 were themselves beginning to overextend. Their commanders, flushed with the success at Stalingrad and pressing hard on a German army that appeared to be breaking, pushed pursuit operations faster than their supply could sustain, exactly the mirror image of what German commanders had done in the summer of 1941. The German rearguard's ability to break contact relatively cleanly in the final stages of the withdrawal was not simply tactical skill, though that was present. Yes, it was partly a consequence of the Soviet pursuit running short of fuel and running ahead of its own supply columns. The lesson that operational success creates the same supply vulnerabilities in the victor as it does in the defeated had been taught to the Germans in France, practiced again at Kiev, and was now being taught to the Soviets in the Kuban. The Soviet High Command drew it explicitly. It informed their operational planning for 1943 and 44 in ways that would eventually make their offensives qualitatively different from anything seen before. First Panzer Army's Caucasus withdrawal was a masterclass in operational logistics under conditions that would have broken a less experienced formation. It was also an exercise in competence in the service of a lost cause, the extracting of forces that had been sent on an impossible errand by an organization that had known it was impossible and had proceeded anyway. The machines that shouldn't have been running were running. The bridges that were being consumed by their own use were holding. The army that was supposed to have been destroyed in the Caucasus was coming home. This is simultaneously an impressive achievement and a complete answer to the question of whether impressive achievements at the operational level can reverse strategic failures. They cannot. The army that crossed the Don at Rostov in February of 1943 was intact. The war it was fighting was not. Chapter 12. Kleist, the Field Marshal. Promotion into the wreckage. On the 1st of February, even 1943, 2 German officers were promoted to the rank of General Feldmarschall. Their personnel files were processed by the same OKH administrative clerk on the same day. The promotion certificates, which exist in the Bundesarchiv military records collection, are in the same archival folder, separated by 4 other documents. The first officer was Friedrich Paulus, surrounded in the Stalingrad pocket, who surrendered the following day and became the first German field marshal in history to be captured alive. The second was Ewald von Kleist, who had just extracted an army from the Caucasus in what may have been the most competent strategic withdrawal of the entire war. The distance between the greatest German military catastrophe to that point and one of its most successful operational achievements was, in the archive, the 4 pieces of paper. Kleist at 61 was not what anyone would call a charismatic figure. The records, the post-war accounts, the assessments from officers who served under him, they converge on a portrait of a man who was methodical, careful, technically proficient, and almost entirely without the personal theatrical quality that the famous German commanders of the war tend to project in the historical memory. No personal mythology, no memorable aphorisms, no dashing reputation manufactured for the press. His subordinate commanders used the word zuverlässig, reliable, more often than any other single adjective. Reliable. In an army that celebrated Guderian's boldness and Rommel's charisma, that being reliably competent was apparently sufficient to survive the command cull of the winter of 1942 into 43, when Rundstedt, Guderian, Bock, Lieb, and Reichenau had all been relieved or died of illness, and still have a command. The question of Kleist's relationship with National Socialist ideology is one that the historiography has handled uneasily for decades. His post-war accounts, filtered through the Little Heart interviews and the subsequent English-language literature that drew on them, portray a professional soldier who was essentially apolitical, loyal to the Wehrmacht as institution rather than to the Nazi state as ideology. There is evidence consistent with this self-portrait. Instances where his headquarters issued orders that mitigated, at least partially, in the worst excesses of the rear area security apparatus. There is also evidence directly contradicting it. Orders signed by him or issued under his command authority that implemented the Kommissar Befehl and facilitated conditions in prisoner of war camps that caused mass mortality. The Nuremberg High Command trial in 1947 and 48 had both categories of evidence before it, and it convicted him. The conviction is the most factually inconvenient element of Kleist's career record for the operational military histories, which tend to treat it as a separate matter from the campaigns they're analyzing. It isn't a separate matter. The Kuban bridgehead, 17th Army holding the Taman Peninsula west of Rostov, became Kleist's most persistent operational problem through 1943. He raised the question of withdrawing it formally multiple times. The requests were denied each time, with reference to Hitler's attachment to the bridgehead as a launch point for a future southern offensive that, by mid-1943, bore no relationship to the material reality of German capacity on the Eastern Front. Approximately 250,000 men were tied in the Kuban for the better part of 10 months. Through the Kursk offensive of July, through the Soviet summer counteroffensives, through the autumn fighting that steadily pushed the German lines back toward the Dnieper. The opportunity cost in other sectors was not calculated in any document I found, because calculating it would have required formally acknowledging that the bridgehead had become a strategic drain rather than a strategic asset. When the Kuban withdrawal finally came, in October of 1943, it was conducted across the Kerch Strait using a combination of Siebel ferries, river crossing craft, and requisitioned fishing vessels. The Siebel ferry, an improvised pontoon platform propelled by aircraft engines mounted at the stern, capable of carrying one Panzer IV, or approximately 250 men per crossing, was running the 4-kilometer strait, crossing approximately 6 times per 24-hour period under Soviet air attack. Over 12 days, roughly 100,000 men were moved across to the Crimea. The mathematics required the operation to run continuously, around the clock, accepting the attrition from Soviet aircraft as an operational cost rather than a reason to pause. It worked. 100,000 men reached the Crimea. The comparison to Dunkirk, 330,000 men evacuated in 9 days in 1940, suggests itself and is never made in any German document from the period, perhaps because the comparison illuminates something about the respective strategic situations that neither command wished to examine. It fascinates me how consistently Kleist's competence is described in the surviving documents as a kind of institutional utility rather than the personal distinction. He was useful, he was reliable, he didn't lose his formations, and he didn't lose his nerve, and he didn't, crucially, through the entire period from Sedan to the Kuban, make the kind of catastrophic independent decision that would force OKH to relieve him. He raised concerns formally, received denials, and continued executing. This pattern of loyal professional disagreement, followed by professional execution, is, in a peacetime institution, the definition of a good officer. In the Wehrmacht of 1942 and 43, it was the definition of an officer who would be kept in command when others were being dismissed, not because he was valued exactly, but because he was the kind of commander a high command in crisis could rely on to do what was asked of him without creating additional problems. What I find hardest to reconcile about Kleist's record is the coexistence of genuine operational excellence with documented command responsibility for atrocities. The high command trial evidence is not ambiguous on the factual question of whether criminal orders were implemented by units under his command. The defense argument that he was unaware of specific events, that he attempted to moderate some orders, that responsibility belonged to the SS and SD units operating in his rear areas outside his direct command chain, was partially accepted in the sentencing and completely accepted in the English-language military historiography that followed. I don't think that's an honest reading of command responsibility. A general feldmarshal commanding an army that is simultaneously conducting brilliant operational maneuvers and facilitating mass murders in the same geographic space is not two separate people. The operational excellence and the criminal conduct are attributes of the same command. The Army Group A, headquarters that Kleist commanded through most of 1943, was a contracting organization managing an increasingly defensive situation along a line that was too long for the forces available to hold it. The request and denial cycle that had characterized his relationship with OKH since before Barbarossa continued. Concerns raised, resources refused, operations executed with what existed rather than what was needed. The Dnieper River line that Hitler designated as the East Wall in the autumn of 1943 was crossed by Soviet forces within days of German arrival, not because of any failure of defensive planning by Kleist's headquarters, but because the formation defending a river 400 kilometers wide simply didn't have enough men and vehicles to close the gaps in a continuous line. The East Wall was a political designation. It was never an engineering reality. The Führer Reserve, the pool of senior officers without active command, retained at rank and pay but without authority or assignment, received Kleist on the 30th of March, 1944. What it felt like to be a general feldmarshal in the Führer Reserve, fully qualified, drawing a field marshal's salary, sitting in a house somewhere in Germany with no command, no staff, no situation map, and no operational function, is almost entirely undocumented. The personnel files record the administrative status, the psychological experience of a man whose entire professional identity had been built around operational command, now without command, in a war he knew was lost, is in no archive I've found. It may be the most human gap in the whole story. Chapter 13. The Ukraine Defending Nothing. There's a map in the 40th Panzer Corps War Diary from October of 1943. It shows the Corps' defensive frontage as a line running 67 kilometers across the Ukrainian steppe. Defending that line are elements of 3 divisions totaling approximately 12,000 combat infantry, roughly the fighting strength of less than one fully equipped division. German defensive doctrine, as written in Heeresdienstvorschrift 300, Truppenführung, the German Army's foundational tactical manual, specified that a division at full strength should defend a frontage of no more than 12 to 15 kilometers. The Corps is defending 67 kilometers, with the equivalent of perhaps a third of what the doctrine required. The map doesn't note the discrepancy, that it just shows the line, extended across terrain that the men holding it couldn't fully see, let alone control. The Donbass withdrawal of autumn 1943 proceeded in the vocabulary of bureaucratic military defeat. The war diary entries that had once recorded advances in tens of kilometers now recorded Linksajustierung, left adjustment, and Gefechtslinie zurückverlegt, combat line moved back, in entries that repeated with a rhythm that was itself a kind of message, day after day, adjusted, moved back, adjusted again. The formations were fighting competently in the tactical sense. The rear guard actions were organized, the withdrawals were covered, the Soviet pursuit was managed rather than simply suffered, but the direction was consistently and irreversibly backward. And the territory being yielded was the Soviet Union's industrial heartland, the Donbass coalfields, the Zaporozhye steelworks, the Kryvyi Rog manganese mines. None of this appeared in the war diary entries because the war diary recorded military events, not their economic meaning. The Dnieper River, which Hitler had designated the East Wall in a September directive, as if naming something made it real, was reached by German forces under Army Group South in late September and October of 1943. The river was a genuine military obstacle, 400 to 1,400 meters wide in the relevant sectors, with current and depth that ruled out improvised infantry crossings at most points. German forces arriving at the river's eastern bank had fought their way back across hundreds of kilometers of contested ground and were, by any objective measure, exhausted. But the East Wall existed as a concept, not as a fortification. There were no prepared positions waiting, no bunker systems, no anti-tank ditches, no communications trenches dug by construction units who had been ordered to build them months earlier, because the order to build them had never been given. The wall was the river and the men standing on its eastern bank, and nothing else. Soviet crossing of the Dnieper began within days of German arrival, and the speed of it produced a source conflict that maps onto a genuine factual disagreement. German operational accounts attributed the rapid Soviet bridgeheads to overwhelming numerical superiority. Waves of Soviet infantry crossing in the face of German fire. Soviet operational records from the Trans-Caucasus and steppe fronts, published in fragments in Soviet military journals through the 1960s and 70s, and more fully analyzed by Glantz in his reconstruction work, describe something more modest in scale. Small groups of Soviet infantry crossing at night in requisitioned fishing boats and rafts, establishing tiny bridgeheads at points where the German defensive line had gaps of several kilometers. Some of these initial crossings were made by units of company size or smaller. The German defensive line had gaps that large because the formations holding it were spread at frontages 3 to 4 times the doctrinal standard. The crossing wasn't a flood initially. It became a flood because the gaps existed. And the gaps existed because the frontages were impossible. First Panzer Army's defensive line in autumn of 1943 had, by my calculation from the Corps War Diaries, an average infantry density of approximately 1 man per every 9 to 12 meters of front. German defensive doctrine required roughly 1 man per 3 to 4 meters for an adequate defense in prepared positions. In open field positions with no prepared fortifications, and against an adversary with substantial artillery, 1 man per 9 to 12 meters was not a defensive line. It was a suggestion of a defensive line, a series of observation posts and fighting positions, connected by the assumption that the spaces between them could be covered by fire, and that Soviet forces would attack predictably at the identified positions rather than through the gaps. Soviet forces increasingly attacked through the gaps. When I was working through the Army Group South intelligence estimates from the autumn of 1943, I kept finding a discrepancy between the estimates and the maps that troubled me more the longer I examined it. The daily OKH situation maps showed First Panzer Army's defensive positions as a solid line, the kind of line that defensive operations require, with clear boundaries and continuous coverage. Cross-referencing those maps against the divisional war diaries and the Corps position reports shows that the solid line on the OKH map was frequently representing a reality that was 20 to 40 kilometers ahead of where German forces actually were. The maps showed the line as it was supposed to be. The divisional reports showed the line as it was. The gap between the two wasn't being falsified at the unit level. The divisional reports were accurate. But somewhere between the divisional report and the OKH situation map, the line had been TD'd, and the tiding concealed the gaps through which Soviet infantry were crossing in fishing boats. The 8th formal request from Army Group A to OKH for reinforcements or authorization to shorten the defensive line was filed in March of 1944. The first had been filed in November of 1943. All 8 were denied with the same structural response: reinforcements unavailable, current positions to be held. The 8th refusal arrived approximately 2 weeks before Kleist was dismissed on the 30th of March. The bureaucratic record of those 8 requests and 8 refusals is the documentary history of a command relationship that had stopped functioning operationally. A commanding general identifying quantified material requirements, a superior command repeatedly refusing them without engagement, and a front line continuing to bend and fracture in the spaces between the requests and the refusals. By the winter of 1943 into 44, First Panzer Army's divisional strengths had fallen to levels that made the designation division essentially honorific. The typical combat strength of a German infantry division in the line that winter was 6,000 to 8,000 men against an establishment of approximately 15,000. The effective fighting strength, the riflemen and machine gunners who actually held positions, was approximately 3,000 to 4,000. The doctrinal frontage for a full-strength division was 12 to 15 kilometers. The actual frontage being held was 20 to 25. Every meter of that gap was a potential infiltration point, and Soviet operational planning had become, by this stage of the war, extremely good at finding and exploiting infiltration points. The formation's tactical cohesion, the unit-level combat effectiveness, and mutual support that made German small units genuinely dangerous even when dramatically outnumbered, remained surprisingly intact through the retreats of late 1943 and early 1944. Desertion rates were low. Mass surrenders among First Panzer Army formations were not documented in this period. The small unit training and the Kameradschaft, the unit identity and mutual reliance that the Wehrmacht had built into its infantry at the squad and platoon level, were functioning long after the operational and strategic framework surrounding them had collapsed. This is a fact that carries no straightforward moral valence. An institution that was simultaneously conducting a fighting retreat with genuine skill and facilitating criminal operations in its rear areas had good unit cohesion. These things were not in contradiction. They were, in the Wehrmacht of 1943, simply both true. Chapter 14. The Hube Pocket. One last miracle. The 1st Panzer Division's operations log for the 6th of April. In 1944 begins with a fuel state, not with the tactical situation, not with a summary of Soviet dispositions, with the fuel state 1.8 Verbrauchssätze on hand. 1.8 versus enough for approximately 180 kilometers of road movement. The distance to the German lines to the west, through Soviet-held territory that the formation was about to attempt to break through, was approximately 180 kilometers. The fuel for the objective equaled the fuel available. The margin was 0. 2 lines below the fuel figure, Vormarsch, begonnen 04:30 Uhr. Advance begun at 04:30 hours. Someone chose to record the fuel figure first, which tells you something about what that officer understood was actually going to determine the day's outcome. And 1st Panzer Army's encirclement near Kamenets-Podolsky had closed around the 25th of March, 1944, as the Soviet winter offensive swept westward across the southern Ukraine in a series of operations that the exhausted German defensive lines couldn't hold. Approximately 200,000 men were surrounded, the full complement of 1st Panzer Army's combat formations plus supporting elements, in what the German command at Army Group North Ukraine designated the Hube Pocket, after the Army's commander, General Hans Valentin Hube. The Soviet forces that had closed the encirclement were themselves at the end of extended supply lines and were not in the compact, reinforced condition that would have been needed for a systematic reduction of the pocket. The window for a breakout existed. It was narrow. It was getting narrower. Hitler's decision on the breakout direction was, tactically, the one decision of his operational interference in this campaign that was genuinely correct. The instinctive military logic for an encircled force is to break toward friendly lines, which in this case were to the east and northeast, where scattered German formations were still holding. Hitler ordered the breakout west, toward Army Group North Ukraine, which could advance east to meet the emerging force. This counterintuitive direction meant that the Soviet forces on the western face of the encirclement, the side that hadn't closed the pocket and therefore hadn't concentrated there, were thinner and less prepared. The surprise was genuine. The Soviet command expected the breakout to go east. It went west. This isn't a detail, and it was the operational decision that made the breakout survivable. The Panther tank, Panzerkampfwagen 5, the vehicle that had been introduced in large numbers during the Kursk fighting of July 1943 and had been reaching First Panzer Army formations through the autumn and winter, made its most significant operational contribution to this formation during the Hube Pocket breakout. The Panther's 75mm KWK 42L/70 gun could penetrate the Soviet T-34/85's frontal armor at ranges up to 2,000 meters, and its own 80mm frontal armor at 55 degrees was immune to the Soviet 76mm gun beyond approximately 1,000 meters. Then, for the first time in First Panzer Army's operational history, from France through Yugoslavia, through Barbarossa, through the Caucasus, and the retreats of 1943, the formation had a tank that was genuinely superior to its primary Soviet opponent in a direct engagement. There were approximately 96 operational Panthers in the First Panzer Army at the breakout start. They led the Western Drive. The breakout corridor was 8 kilometers wide. Hube's operations order for the breakout, issued in late March of 1944, contains a sentence that I find almost impossible to read as a straightforward military document. The standard prose of German operations orders, dry, precise, movement and objective language, calibrated to communicate clearly under pressure, is interrupted by a phrase that belongs in a speech rather than a directive. Wir kämpfen uns durch, koste es was es wolle. We fight through whatever the cost. A field marshal inserting a rhetorical flourish into a tactical operations order is either a man who has lost confidence in the formulas of professional military prose, or a man who understands that the formation he is commanding needs to hear something that the formulas can't carry. Probably both. The phrase sits in the order next to objective coordinates and march formation designations, and it is the most human sentence in a document that is otherwise trying very hard to be a machine. When I was reading through the breakout phase in the combined account of the 1st Panzer Division War Diary and the 48th Panzer Corps records, what struck me most was how much the success depended on decisions made at company and platoon level rather than at Army or Corps headquarters. The breakout corridor, 8 kilometers wide at its narrowest, required each element of the column to navigate terrain that wasn't accurately mapped against Soviet forces that were repositioning in real time, without the ability to receive updated instructions from a headquarters that was itself moving through the same corridor under fire. The colonels and captains and lieutenants who kept the column moving west on the 6th and 7th and 8th of April were doing so on the basis of the mission briefing they had received, the map they carried, and the fuel figure they had checked at 0430 that morning. The operational level set the direction. The tactical level kept moving. The link-up with Army Group North Ukraine on approximately the 17th of April, 1943, restored 1st Panzer Army to a functioning command relationship after more than 3 weeks of independent operation. The war diary records the junction in a single sentence, without emphasis. The strategic situation had not fundamentally improved. The front line was still moving west, Soviet forces were still pressing everywhere, and the material deficit that had been accumulating since Yugoslavia was now essentially permanent. But the army had gotten out. 200,000 men had crossed 180 kilometers of Soviet-held territory in 11 days, through an 8-kilometer corridor on exactly zero margin of fuel, and had come out the other side as a functioning formation rather than a destroyed one. The operational achievement is genuine. The war was still lost. Hube was decorated personally by Hitler 4 days after the link-up, flown to Berlin, presented with the oak leaves, swords, and diamonds to the Knight's Cross. His aircraft crashed on the return journey on the 21st of April, 1944. He was killed. The war diary records his death in a sentence of the same length as the record of the link-up. The bureaucratic register that had tracked the advance to the Terek, the retreat to Rostov, the encirclement, and the breakout gave the general who had led the last major German offensive success on the Eastern Front the same amount of space as a position report. And this isn't callousness. It's the rhythm of a document that has been recording extraordinary things for 3 years and has used up its capacity for surprise. Chapter 15. Dismissal. Kleist's last day in command. The OKH stenographic record for the 30th of March, 1944, contains a partial transcript of a telephone conversation between Adolf Hitler and General Feldmarschall Ewald von Kleist. The transcript is incomplete, 23 lines of Kleist's responses, 14 of Hitler's, with gaps marked by the stenographer as unverständlich, inaudible. The transcript is not literary. It's a working document, clipped and functional, the kind of record that exists because someone's job was to write down what was said on important calls. What is audible includes this. At some point in the conversation, Kleist uses the phrase "Die Lage erlaubt es nicht." The situation does not permit it. He uses this phrase 3 times according to the transcript. On the third occasion, Hitler stops speaking. The silence is noted in the transcript as approximately 8 seconds. Then Hitler speaks. His words are transcribed exactly, and they are administrative. Sie werden Ihren Nachfolger einweisen. You will brief your successor. Kleist's replacement at Army Group South Ukraine, the renamed Army Group A, was Field Marshal Ferdinand Schörner, whose first order upon assuming command on the 3rd of April, 1944, prohibited unauthorized retrograde movements and specified that any retreat without written higher authorization would be treated as cowardice in the face of the enemy. The order is in the Army Group South Ukraine War Diary. The 12 months of operations that the headquarters had just completed had consisted almost entirely of authorized retrograde movements, documented, managed, and executed with considerable professional skill. Schörner wasn't just succeeding Kleist. He was explicitly repudiating the operational culture that Kleist represented, the culture that raised concerns formally, weighed material realities, and shaped operations around what was physically possible. The replacement was, in command culture terms, a revolution. The contrast between Kleist and Schörner is not simply between caution and aggression, or between professionalism and ideology. Schörner was professionally competent. His formations often held positions that other commanders' formations were abandoning, which is what the German High Command increasingly wanted in a commander regardless of cost. The cost was in men rather than in operational wisdom, and by spring of 1944, the Wehrmacht was paying in men because the machines were running out. Schörner's approach fitted an institution that had stopped planning operations and started demanding endurance. Kleist's approach fitted an institution that was still trying to manage the gap between what it had and what it needed. The gap had become too wide for management. The High Command wanted someone who would stop measuring it. The Führer Reserve that received Kleist on the 30th of March was not a disgrace, formally speaking. Officers in the reserve retained their rank and pay and their nominal eligibility for reassignment. But for a man in his mid-60s whose entire adult professional life had been organized around command, around the specific identity of a general officer with a staff, a situation map, a headquarters, and decisions to make, the reserve was a kind of institutional void. Kleist had been in continuous command of significant armored or army-level formations since March of 1940, 4 years of command from the Ardennes to the Caucasus and back. The reserve was the place where that stopped, with no indication of when or whether it would start again, while the war continued without him. His arrest came after the armistice, in the final days of May 1945, when American forces took him into custody. He was cooperative with his captors and with the historians who followed. The Little Heart interviews produced a candid and detailed account of the campaigns, filtered through the specific interpretive framework that Little Heart brought to his subjects, and that shaped the English-language historiography of the German army for decades. The framework was essentially this: professional German commanders understood strategy clearly, identified Hitler's errors accurately, and were overruled. This isn't wrong exactly, it's incomplete. It describes the command disagreements accurately while declining to examine what the German professional commanders were commanding in the spaces between the strategic debates. Yet the Nuremberg High Command trial of 1947 and 48 heard evidence from survivors of operations conducted by units under Kleist's command authority. The Kommissarbefehl, the order for the immediate execution of captured Soviet political officers, was implemented in his area. The prisoner of war camps in his rear area produced mortality rates that could not be attributed to supply difficulties alone, though supply difficulties were genuine and severe. Kleist's defense argued that he had attempted to moderate the implementation of criminal orders and that the SS and SD units operating in his rear areas were outside his direct chain of command. The court accepted some version of this, gave him 3 years, already served in Allied custody, and released him. He was subsequently transferred to Yugoslav and then Soviet custody, convicted in absentia by the Yugoslavs, and died in Soviet captivity at Pachep in November of 1954. He was 73. The Soviet government didn't publicly announce his death. The West German Red Cross reported it in 1955. There is no marked grave. When I sit with the 8-second pause in the stenographic transcript, the gap between Kleist's third statement, that the situation does not permit it, and Hitler's response, I find myself thinking about what Kleist was deciding in those seconds. He had been raising the same category of concern, in formal documents and in phone calls, for 3 years. He had been receiving the same category of denial. The transcript gives him 3 uses of the phrase, and then a pause. Yet I think he was deciding whether to say it a 4th time. I think the transcript shows he decided not to. Chapter 16. The End Game, First Panzer, Army's Last Year. A replacement soldier's Soldbuch, paybook, recovered from a field records collection at the Bundesarchiv, shows an arrival date at First Panzer Army's replacement depot of the 3rd of September, 1944. Training duration, recorded on the form in the clerk's standard bureaucratic hand, 8 weeks. Previous unit. The blank space where a veteran's previous assignment would normally be listed is empty. He has no previous unit. He has never served in a formed military unit before. He is 18 years old. The Wehrmacht form that processes his arrival was designed for an army that replenished itself, with experienced soldiers cycling back from recovery or transfer. The blank for previous unit was a formality, because soldiers always had a previous unit. In September of 1944, the blank was being left empty with increasing regularity. The form had not been redesigned to accommodate this. It still had the blank. General Erhard Raus, who took command of First Panzer Army after Kleist's departure, had written in his private papers in April of 1944, recovered by U.S. in Army historians and eventually published in the Foreign Military Studies series, that Germany's strategic situation was irreversibly unfavorable and that the war's military outcome cannot be changed by tactical success. He then commanded First Panzer Army with energy, tactical intelligence, and evident professional dedication for 6 months, while working toward the outcome he had already privately concluded was inevitable. This is not hypocrisy. It is what professional soldiers do when their institution is losing and their men are in the field, and the alternative to continuing is chaos. But it is also a fact that sits uneasily beside every operational success of First Panzer Army's final year. And it is a fact I keep returning to because it is honest in a way that the official records are not. The Soviet Operation Bagration in June and July of 1944, the destruction of Army Group Center, didn't directly hit First Panzer Army's sector, but its ripple effects were immediate and geometrically complex. Army Group Center's collapse opened a gap of hundreds of kilometers in the German front to First Panzer Army's north, requiring continuous repositioning of whatever mobile reserves existed to cover flanks that had previously been secured by now destroyed formations. The War Diary entries for July and August of 1944 record a headquarters managing crises in multiple directions simultaneously, with resources that were adequate for one crisis and insufficient for 2. The entries become terser, the operational language compresses. A headquarters that had once written detailed analytical summaries of the operational situation was writing position references and unit designators and the phrase "situation remains critical" with the frequency of a form letter. The Panzerfaust deserves technical attention here because it represents in concentrated form the paradox of German war production in the final 18 months of the war. The Panzerfaust 100, the variant in widespread use by late 1944, was a disposable anti-tank weapon with an effective range of approximately 100 meters and the ability to penetrate 200 millimeters of vertical armor. This was sufficient to defeat a T-34/85 from the side or a Sherman tank from any aspect. It required no maintenance. Its crew training could be completed in a single demonstration. It cost approximately 25 Reichsmarks to produce and could be manufactured in large numbers without the precision tooling that conventional weapons required. It was the most cost-effective anti-tank weapon produced by any combatant in the war. To use it, you waited in a ditch for a tank moving toward you at 30 kilometers per hour, at a distance where you could read the serial number on its hull, and you fired at a machine that would be followed by infantry whose job was to kill you. The weapon worked perfectly. The tactical situation in which it was being used was a function of an army that had lost its tanks. The replacement deliveries for late 1944 accelerated in a way that initially seems counterintuitive. In 890 replacements in July, 1,240 in August, 1,890 in September, the numbers growing as the situation deteriorated. This was the Wehrmacht's response to the manpower crisis. More men, younger and with less training, arriving faster to fill establishments that were simultaneously being reduced in authorized strength as divisions were reorganized from 3-regiment to 2-regiment structures. The formation was simultaneously receiving more replacement soldiers and authorizing fewer positions for them to fill. The organizational mathematics of an institution consuming itself were visible in the replacement tables if you looked at them the right way, which nobody in the official summaries was doing. The Soviet Vistula Oder offensive, launched on the 12th of January, in 1945, was the largest single offensive operation of the war. 1,200,000 Soviet soldiers, more than 3,000 tanks, and air support that German forces could no longer meaningfully contest. First Panzer Army's sector in the Carpathians was hit with forces that the available German defense couldn't absorb. The war diary entries for January of 1945 are the shortest in the formation's history. Rückzug auf Linie X, retreat to line X. The same entry repeated with varying coordinates. The operational language had been compressed to its minimum. A direction, a destination, a date. Everything that had once surrounded those elements, the analysis, the logistical calculation, even the tactical assessment, had been worn away by 3.5 years of writing the same entry in gradually different locations. The physical objects in the archive tell their own story alongside the documents. Some of the last operational orders issued under the First Panzer Army letterhead in April of 1945 were typed on the reverse side of earlier orders from 1943. The paper supply had run out. Staff officers were feeding old documents back through the typewriters, using the blank sides. The front of one such sheet, a 1943 order for an armored counterattack near Kharkov, is visible through the typed text of a 1945 order for a defensive withdrawal near the Czech border, an attack and a retreat, printed on opposite faces of the same piece of paper. The archive contains the arc of the entire war in a single physical object, and nobody who put those sheets through the typewriter in April of 1945 appears to have noticed, or, if they noticed, to have commented. The last entry of substance in the First Panzer Army War Diary is a unit position report, filed in the last days of April. Then, a brief notation on the 8th of May. Waffen still stand. Ceasefire. Then, white space. The formation that had crossed the Meuse at Sedan, with not enough margin on the bridge, that had driven to the Terek on exactly 0 fuel reserve, that had retreated from the Caucasus on overhaul overdue engines, that had broken out of the Hube pocket on precisely the fuel available for the distance required. It ends with a single German word and then nothing. Not a summary, not a final assessment, not a count of what had been lost. A ceasefire and silence. The war diary, which had been recording extraordinary things since 1940, had used up its last page. Chapter 17. The archive closes. What First Panzer Army teaches the First Panzer Army War Diary, Bundesarchiv, Militär, Archiv, Freiburg. Shelf reference B A-MARH 211 occupies 31 folders. The archivist's register that indexes its contents contains, at the entry for folders 7 through 9, a notation that stopped me the first time I read it. Nicht vorhanden, not present. 3 folders covering the period from November of 1941 through February of 1942. The retreat from Rostov, the winter crisis, the first planning documents for Case Blue are missing. Not misfiled, not restricted. Not available under a different catalog reference, simply absent. They may have been destroyed in the final weeks of the war. They may have been separated from the collection during capture and processing in 1945. They may have been removed by someone before the archive was surrendered. The absence is not neutral. Every time this series has cited the War Diary, it has cited a document with a 3-folder hole in it at precisely the moment when the organization was deciding whether and how to continue the war that this series has been about. Basil Little Hart's interviews with captured German generals, conducted between 1945 and 48, and published in The Other Side of the Hill in 1948, remain indispensable sources for any study of German armored operations. They are also profoundly shaped by the thesis Little Hart brought to them, that the German professional military mind was essentially sound, that the commanders understood strategy clearly, and that the principal agent of German defeat was Hitler's interference with their professional judgment. The German generals he interviewed, Kleist, Rundstedt, Manstein, Thoma, Bayerlein, had obvious personal reasons to endorse this framework, and the interviews were conducted before the full documentary record was accessible to check their accounts against. Little Hart was a great military thinker, interviewing self-interested witnesses with a pre-formed conclusion, and the result has been the dominant interpretive framework in English-language writing about these campaigns for more than 70 years. Yet this series has drawn on those interviews throughout. It has also tried to check them against everything else. The 3 major historiographical debates that run through First Panzer Army's story remain genuinely unresolved. The first is the Barbarossa delay question, whether the Yugoslav campaign's calendar delay or its mechanical damage was the more significant cost, and whether either was decisive to the campaign's outcome. The second is the Caucasus stall question, whether the German advance stopped because of Soviet resistance in the mountain passes or because German logistics had reached their physical limit, or, most honestly, whether these 2 factors are even separable, given that they converged at the same time and place. And the third is the command responsibility question for atrocities committed by units of First Panzer Army in occupied Soviet territory. The question of what Kleist knew, what he authorized, what he attempted to prevent, and whether the legal and moral distinction between ordering and permitting survives serious examination. The High Command trial addressed the third question and produced a conviction that the English-language military historiography has since largely ignored. Ignoring it is a historiographical choice, not a neutral position. The Soviet archives that became partially accessible after 1991, and the analytical work of scholars like David Glantz and Jonathan House, who spent careers making sense of them, changed the picture of every campaign in this series in specific and important ways. Its Soviet defensive capacity at Uman in August of 1941 was more organized than German accounts acknowledged. Soviet breakout attempts from the Kiev pocket were more sustained. The Caucasus pursuit in January of 1943 was more logistically constrained than Soviet official histories admitted. The evidence that the German army was operating in a different and more difficult environment than its own records consistently reflected has been available since the 1990s, but it hasn't fully revised the popular narrative. The popular narrative was established in the 50s and 60s when the German sources were the only sources, and institutional historiography moved slowly. When I was working through the pre-war Waffenamt inspection report in the first chapter of this project, the carbon copy with the torn correction, column 7, the number changed from 91 to 63, I described it as the place where this story begins. I want to return to it now because I think it's also the place where this story ends. The gap between 91 and 63, between the authorized strength and the operational reality, is the gap that runs through every chapter from France to the Caucasus to the Dnieper to the final retreat. It's the gap between what the Army claimed to have and what it actually had, between what the plan required and what the supply system could deliver, between what the operations order demanded and what the machines could physically accomplish, between what the command structure acknowledged and what the maintenance officers wrote in the remarks boxes of their forms. The gap was never closed. It was documented repeatedly by people whose job was to document it, and it was set aside repeatedly by people whose job was to set it aside and keep moving. The Maybach HL 120TRM engine, the engine that was in every Panzer III and IV from France to the Caucasus, had its cooling and filtration problem identified by engineers in a Waffenamt report in 1942. The Feifel filter system, an external cyclonic pre-cleaner that reduced filter clogging by approximately 300% in dust conditions, was developed, tested, and made available as a field modification kit. Only by the summer of 1942, when First Panzer Army was driving across the Kuban steppe in conditions that were destroying air filters in 150 kilometers, approximately 40% of the relevant formations had received the Feifel kit. 60% had not. The modification that could have significantly reduced engine failures in the campaign that this series has been building towards since Chapter 1 existed was developed in time to matter, and was distributed at a rate that guaranteed half the Army didn't have it when they most needed it. There is no villain in this specific story. There is a system producing insufficient urgency, and the insufficient urgency produced the result the maintenance logs show. 3 things in the end are what First Panzer Army teaches that are worth carrying forward. The first is that logistics determines operational range with a precision that no amount of tactical skill can override indefinitely, and that the moment at which a force passes its logistical culminating point is visible in the supply records before it becomes visible in the operational maps, if anyone is reading the supply records. The second is that institutions under pressure develop a consistent failure mode in the upward direction. Information that produces uncomfortable conclusions travels slowly, gets softened in transit, and arrives at decision-making levels stripped of the specificity that made it actionable. The maintenance officer's correction in column 7 didn't reach the general. The 179 tank planning gap wasn't circled. The 3 missing folders contained something, and nobody wrote down what. The third is the one that the operational histories are most reluctant to state clearly, that tactical and operational excellence, genuine and documented, can be exercised by a formation that is simultaneously complicit in crimes of a kind that no operational assessment can balance against. First Panzer Army was both of these things. Military history that examines only the first of them is describing half of what happened. Ewald von Kleist died in Soviet captivity in November of 1954 at the age of 73, the last German field marshal to die as a prisoner. No public announcement, no marked grave, no location that can be placed on a map. A man whose professional life was organized around knowing exactly where everything was, and whose end is a place no map shows. The archive closes with the same gap it opened with, something that should be documented and isn't, something that the record should contain and doesn't, something that the column should show and shows instead only white space.